Chapter 9. The Afterworld. The Greek view of the soul and of death. To comprehend, even in part, the Greek stories of the Afterworld, one must keep before him the fact that they are all based on the conception that the soul has a life apart from the body. This the Greeks held to be as certain as anything could be in the realm of the inscrutable, and all the phenomena of life seemed to point to its truth. When, however, they came to state their belief as to what the soul really was, they frankly argued from probability. The soul could not well be very unlike the living man. Therefore, it was his shade, or airy double. This shade either comprised or was identical with all that was characteristic of the man. His personality, we say, for this is what vanished at death, while the inert body remained. Moreover, like the man himself, the shade was able to think, feel the drive of desire, and move about from place to place. On the other hand, the soul could not be very like the man, for the conditions of concrete existence could not surround it, and, moreover, it must be of a very tenuous substance, for it seemed to leave the body through a wound or with the passing of the invisible breath, and untrammeled by the body, it was free to go about, as on wings, whithersoever it would, like the birds of heaven. Yet all its thoughts and desires were faint and futile, for it utterly lacked the material means of gratifying them, so that the existence of the disembodied soul was joyless, and the end of all that men esteem worthwhile. The words of Hecate to Andromache well sum up the attitude of the Greek towards death. Death cannot be what life is, child. The cup of death is empty, and life hath always hope. But the Greeks strangely contradicted themselves. Though affirming the immateriality of souls, they were unable to conceive of their conscious existence without at least some of the accessories of the material. After death, a man's shade pursued the same occupations which it had followed in life, and cherished the same characteristic passions. Orion still hunted the wild beasts of the woodland. Aias still harbored his anger against Achilles. Iacchos and Rhadamanthus still sat on the tribunals of judgment. Tiresias still dispensed his prophecies. This bondage to the material extended even to the punishments of the arch-criminals. Ixion was bound to be a real wheel, and Sisyphus struggled with a real stone. When the Greeks came to localize the abode of the assembled shades, they not unnaturally, like many other peoples, believed it to be under the earth, an idea which probably sprang from the primitive custom of burial. And after the belief had once been established, it was easy to think of those souls that had been banished from their bodies by cremation as going to the same place. In this underworld were gathered the souls of all except a special few, souls that were thenceforth like to pale flocks fallen as leaves, folds of dead people, and alien from the sun. It was a spacious democratic realm in which they abode, a realm in which there was no fear of overcrowding. Its boundaries were impassable, and rarely did a soul return from it to the upper light, even for a brief season. It was a kingdom organized like a kingdom of earth. Hades and Persephone sat on its two thrones as king and queen, and it had its several benches of judges. Hermes mustered the immigrants bound for its shows, and Charon, the grim, grey ferryman, transported them at the established tariff on an obol ahead, while Kerberos, the three-headed hound, stood guard at its main entrance. Its area was delimited into various precincts determined by natural boundaries, and its population was divided into classes, the ordinary rank and file of the departed on the one hand, and the sinners extraordinary on the other. The lower realm was indeed a world in itself. Entrances to and rivers of the underworld. Although some were skeptical enough to say that no roads lead underground, yet the average Greek entertained no other opinion than that such paths did exist. In a number of places, the inhabitants pointed to local caves whence the ways ran downward. For instance, at Tynaron in Laconia, at Troezen in Argolis, at Ephyra in Thesprotia, and at Heraclea in Pontus, while Hermione in Argolis offered to short a route that those who travelled along it were exempted from the payment of the usual obol. Often, white rocks by the banks of streams were held to mark the proximity of the lower world, or, again, the channels through which springs or streams disappeared beneath the ground passed as entrances to Hades. Indeed, it seems possible that the Styx and the Acheron, the oldest of the rivers of Hades, were originally just such streams. In time, the imagination of the Greeks gave them almost wholly an infernal existence and developed from them three others: Cocytus, Pyriphlegethon, and Lethe. The relations of all these to one another, that is, whether they were main streams or tributaries, were by no means uniform. Nevertheless, each had its own distinct significance in literature. The Styx was the river of hate. Acheron, with its chill, stagnant water, the river of mourning. Cocytus, the river of lamentation. Lethe, the river of forgetfulness. And Pyriphlegethon, the river of flame. The judges. The better and earlier tradition recognizes three judges in Hades: Iacchos, king of Aegina, and Rhadamanthys and Minos, the sons of Zeus and Europe. The later and Attic tradition adds Triptolemos as a fourth. The first three were endowed with distinct individualities. Iacchos, by virtue of his being the wisest in deed and in counsel among mortals, was given the principal place among the judges, and to his care, moreover, were entrusted the keys of Hades' house. To him the souls from Europe came to be judged, while his brother Rhadamanthys, seated at the crossways where one road led to the Happy Isles and the other to Tartarus, judged the souls from Asia. Souls whose origin was in doubt appeared before Minos, who, wielding a golden scepter, exercised both civil and judicial power, as he had done on earth. The punishments of Hades. Only that class of the inhabitants of Hades whom we have called the sinners extraordinary suffered special punishments. Their sins had been against the gods. For disclosing to men the counsel of Zeus, and for his horrible banquet, Tantalus was condemned to stand in a pool that ever receded from his thirsty lips, while near him hung branches laden with fruit that always sprang away from his hungry grasp, and over his head was poised a stone that continually threatened to fall, but never did. Titios had in his lifetime attempted violence on Leto, and for this his huge body was stretched out supine on the soil of Hades, and two vultures never ceased gnawing at his vitals. Ixion forgot his debt of gratitude to Zeus and made a foul attack on Hera, so that, in Hades, he was lashed to a wheel and whirled around forever, his fate being a perpetual warning to ingrates. For their sacrilegious attempt to scale heaven by piling up mountains into a grand staircase, Otus and Ephialtes were bound by serpents to two great columns. Of the punishments of Sisyphus and of the daughters of Danaus, enough has been already said. Visits of the living to Hades. Consistent with the belief in roads leading to the lower world is the tradition that certain human beings of almost divinely rare endowments, or through some interposition of the gods, had been able to follow these paths to their end and again to see the light of day. Protesilaus returned to life for a few short hours only, but Alcestis and Glaucus, the son of Minos, for many years. Patroclus descended by Tainaron and came back by Troezen, bringing Kerberos with him. And Theseus accompanied Peirithous below in his foolhardy mission to rob Hades of Persephone, although his safe return was due only to the superior strength of Heracles. The most famous descents were those of Odysseus and Orpheus, that of the former furnishing inspiration to Virgil and Dante in their treatment of similar themes, and to those modern poets who have depicted Christ in Hades. At the word of Circe, Odysseus approached the underworld by way of the land of the Cimmerians, a people who dwelt amid clouds and gloom and never looked upon the face of the sun. Here he dug a trench and poured into it the blood of black victims, and soon the gibbering ghosts began to gather about the trench, clamouring for the blood, which, for a time, Odysseus would not permit them to touch. First there appeared to him the restless shade of his former shipmate Elpenor, begging him to accomplish the due rites over his unburied body. And at length there came the ghost of Tiresias, the blind seer of Thebes. When Odysseus allowed him and the other shades to taste of the blood, memories of the upper world and the power of speech returned to them. And from Tiresias he learned the vicissitudes that were to mark the remainder of his life down to the day of his death. Then he saw his mother Anticleia, who, though now merely a phantom, had not lost the tenderness of a mother for him, recounting to him what had happened in Ithaca during his long absence, just those things that only a mother thinks of telling, the little happenings about the home that make or mar the life within it. After her he saw a host of the famous wives and mothers of the gods and heroes, both the chaste and the unchaste, and when the shades of the womenfolk were scattered by Persephone, the ghosts of the men crowded about, and drinking of the blood, told Odysseus, one by one, the sorry tales of their last days, and with grief or delight listened to the tidings which he had brought them of the kinsfolk whom they had left behind. First came Agamemnon, surrounded by the shades of those who had died with him at Aegisthus' fatal banquet, and then Achilles, proud to learn of the glory of Neoptolemus among the living, Aias, still brooding over his imagined dishonour, Minos, wielding his golden sceptre and dealing out dooms to the dead, and Orion, hunting across the asphodel meadows and the ghosts of the animals which he had slain in life. Last of all, Odysseus beheld the great sufferers of Hades, Tantalus, Tityos, Sisyphus, Ixion, and the rest, and would have seen more of the renowned heroes, had not the increasing throng and clamour of the shades filled his breasts with fear and caused him to fly to his ship and sail away down the stream of Okeanos. From the account of this visit of Odysseus to Hades, as it stands in the Odyssey itself, more can be learned of the prevailing Greek conception of the state of the dead than from any other single source. The story of the descent of Orpheus is of a very different character. Eurydice, the young wife of Orpheus, the sweet singer of Thrace, was bitten by a serpent, and, dying, her soul passed within the pale of Hades' realm. Orpheus resolved to win her back, and as he entered the abode of the shades, with a song on his lips, the pallid souls burst into weeping. Tantalus ceased to pursue the retreating water. Ixion and his wheel stood still. The vultures abandoned their torment of Tityos. The daughters of Danaus deserted their jars, and Sisyphus sat down upon the rock. Down the cheeks of the Erinyes flowed moist tears, and the king and queen of Tartarus yielded to his plea that they set his dear wife free. One condition, however, was imposed, that, as Eurydice followed her husband on the way out, he was on no account to turn around and look upon her. But, in the ecstasy of his joy at his recovery of her, he violated the condition, and Eurydice was recalled to Hades, never more to return to earth. Elysion, the Islands of the Blessed. The domain of Hades was not, however, the only abode of those who had come to the end of this life, for there was, besides this, a land of eternal happiness, with broad flowery fields, known now as Elysion, and now as the Islands of the Blessed. The Greeks naturally thought of this land as lying in the distant west, some even identifying it with the island of the Phaeacians, or again with Leuc or White Isle at the western end of the Euxine. According to Pindar, only those mortals were translated thither who had come through a triple test in life and had remained good and brave and true. Although from other literary sources one gathers that the common belief was that the land was reserved for those in whose veins flowed the blood of the gods. It was indeed for this reason alone, and not for any special piety, that Menelaus and Helen were admitted into its bliss, though Peleus, Achilles, Cadmus, and many others of the heroes were there, who by virtue of passing either test could have entered this land, whose charm can be best conveyed by the words of Proteus to Menelaus. But thou, Menelaus, son of Zeus, art not ordained to die and meet thy fate in Argos, the pasture land of horses, but the deathless gods will convey thee to the Elysian plain and the world's end, where is Rhadamanthus of the fair hair, where life is easiest for men. No snow is there, nor yet great storm, nor any rain, but always ocean sendeth forth the breeze of the shrill west to blow cool on men. Yea, for thou hast Helen to wife, and thereby they deem thee to be the son of Zeus. Part 2. The Greek Gods. Chapter 1. The Greater Gods, Zeus and Hera. Almost all the gods who are considered in this and the next few chapters are universally regarded as the greater personages of the Greek pantheon, although a few who are confessedly not of this rank have been given a place here, because of the difficulty and impropriety of dealing with them apart from their more distinguished fellows with whom they are inseparably associated. For instance, Hecate is the natural companion of Artemis, Eros of Aphrodite, and Persephone and Hades of Demeter. We have obtained our list of greater gods by combining the Homeric, Athenian, and Olympian systems, though from the last named we have omitted Kronos, Rhea, Alpheus, and the Charites. Zeus. Between the Zeus of the historical period and the Zeus of the primitive Greeks, there is a great gulf fixed. It is not, however, entirely unspanned, for the diligent research of many years has succeeded in throwing over its bridges of inference and deduction, which, while slender, afford the hope that they may serve as the foundations for stronger structures in the future. Any statements that we may make, therefore, in reference to this void we give with reserve, even though we may not preface each individual statement with a specific word of caution. It must be remembered that our present endeavour is to trace the transformation of the Zeus, not of a single locality, but of all Hellenic localities, to sketch the lineaments, as it were, of a great composite Zeus, who would be recognized at first glance by all Hellenes as the chief god of their cults and myths. The original significance of Zeus. Zeus was the great aboriginal god not only of all the Hellenic stocks, but of the so-called Indo-European race. Nor does the predominating importance of his celestial functions in ritual, myth, and epithet permit of any other inference than that he was a personification of the bright sky. The coincidence of these activities with those of the great sky god of cognate name of other Indo-European peoples points in the same direction. And, moreover, his name alone is a proof of his origin, for it is the development of the base dea, to shine, probably passing through the stages of pronunciation, if not of orthography. While in the invocation of Father Zeus, we can readily perceive a parallel to the Latin Jupiter or Dies Piter, and in the Indian Rig Veda, the phrase Diau Piter or Father Sky occurs in several passages. In most instances, the non-celestial functions of Zeus can be shown to be more or less natural efflorescences, so to speak, of his celestial activities, although sometimes they may be suspected of being the results of contamination with the worship of other divinities. In dealing with the personality of Zeus, one must avoid being misled by his mere name, which was occasionally applied to other beings than of chief Olympian. Thus Hades, or Plauton, was sometimes spoken of as Zeus, but it was through metaphor, for was not Hades the Zeus of the underworld? Rain-making fetishes in various districts were at times addressed as Zeus by local votaries, and through haste and ignorance, Hellenic travellers would often designate as Zeus the leading male divinity of a strange community, this identity being presumed most frequently of all when they were journeying in distinctly barbarian countries. It is the genuine Zeus, the sky god, with whom we are concerned. The Zeus of Homer. In the Iliad and the Odyssey, Zeus no longer appears as the sole divine arbiter of the sky and the supreme lord of the weather, for both Hera and Poseidon stir up wind and wave against those who have incurred their anger, apparently with only little less freedom of initiative than of Zeus himself. Yet, when the Greeks set sail homeward from Troy, we learn in the Odyssey, it was Zeus who scattered the ships, and after Odysseus's companions perfidiously slew the cattle of the sun in Thrinacia, it was Zeus who brought the disaster of shipwreck upon them. Despite the encroachments upon his power, he still remained the undisputed master of the thunder and the lightning, so that when, on the morning before the slaughter of the suitors, Odysseus heard the roar of thunder, he knew it to be a sign from Zeus that he would not thwart his plans. This sort of omen could, however, be interpreted as unfavorable or even as doubtful, as when, on one occasion, thunder which lasted all night long set both the Greek and Trojan armies to wondering what Zeus had in store for them, and made all the warriors turn pale with fear. Although in Homer the original character of Zeus had become dim, whether in reality or by contrast, one side of his nature was very clearly illumined. He was potentially the ruler of the universe. The other gods had their departmental functions in nature, but Zeus could usurp them if only he chose to do so. And in the last analysis, his will was supreme, being limited by nothing, for it itself was fate. He was not merely an Olympian. He was the Olympian. Nor was he the petty god of a tribe or nation, for all the peoples of whom Homer had cognizance acknowledged his supremacy as father of gods and men, although the title father conveyed not so much the idea that he was of necessity a physical father or the creator of men and things. On the contrary, Okeanos was the great creative source of all living things in Homer. As that, he exercised over the great family of beings, human, and divine, that kind of rule which we call paternalistic. To men he dispensed joys or ills as he pleased. He determined for them the issues of their battles in arms until they became mere puppets. And according to his whim he warned or deluded by omens. Unlike the other gods, he observed a strict neutrality in the Trojan War, save when it suited his purpose to lean toward this side or toward that, and he became gravely ethical on occasion, as when he rebuked Eris as a lover of contention, or when he ordered concord among the Ithacans. Though at other times, open-eyed, he flung ethics to the winds, as he did when he devised means for breaking the solemn truce between the Trojans and the Achaeans. He wielded, Roman-like, a patria potestas over the universe, for he weighed the fates of Hector and Achilles in the scales and assented to Hector's death. This paternalistic attitude showed most clearly in the circle of the gods, whom he convened in the dictatorial manner of a feudal chieftain, and who espoused one or the other cause before Troy simply because he said they might. His ipse dixit, conveyed by Hermes, forced Calypso to release Odysseus against her heart and will. He bestowed boons upon the other gods, but only as he was convinced of the real need for them in each instance, or as he was forced through guile. At times he stepped down from his throne to mingle with his fellows on the common floor of Olympus, but he never lost consciousness of his superiority. In all this, we are to see not the absolute political ideal of the Homeric period, but rather the refined portrayal of the conditions of state to which the Greeks of that time had advanced. The birth and death of Zeus. When Pausanias frankly admits that he found it hard to enumerate all the Greek localities which claimed to be the birthplace of Zeus, the difficulty and folly of our attempting at this late date to draw up anything like a complete catalogue of them is very apparent. In Messenia and Arcadia alone, he records no less than 5 such places, among them Mount Ithome, the acropolis of the city of Messene. The account makes no mention of the parentage of Zeus, which leads one to think that the traditional legend of the Hesiodic story is to be assumed. Born then of Cronos and Rhea, Zeus was hurried away by the Chorites, an order of priests, to Mount Ithome for fear of the evil designs of his father, and there was placed in the care of 2 local nymphs, Neda and Ithome, who washed him in the waters of a spring on the slopes of the mountain, Neda giving her name to the nearby river, and Ithome hers to the mountain. While in the most childish fashion, the theft of the child and his bath in the water of the fountain were combined to attach to the spring the name Clepsydra, or stolen water. The god was also said to have been born on Mount Aigaion in Arcadia, where he was suckled by a goat, although Mount Lycaon of the same district and a mountain near Lydian Sardes were likewise claimed for this honor. The most famous of all the birthplaces, however, was the island of Crete, the legends variously pointing to Mounts Dicte, Ida, and Lectos as the exact locality of the birth. In the most wildly prevailing version, Rhea succeeded in escaping from Cronos just in time to bear Zeus in a cave in one of these mountains, and in answer to the rapacious demands of the new father, gave him a wrapped stone to swallow instead of the child. The infant was cared for by Amalthea, a goat, or by local nymphs, who, one story runs, hung him in a cradle on a tree to elude the keen searches of Cronos, while, in order to add to the deception, the Chorites were appointed to take up their post close by and to make a great din by clashing their arms and brazen shields together, thus drowning the child's cries. Other legends say that it was a cow or a sow which nursed the infant. On the death of Cronos, Zeus assumed the dominion over the world. While the fully developed pan-Hellenic Zeus was truly one of the immortal gods who feasted on ambrosia and nectar, yet several local forms of Zeus were said to die, and an epigram attributed to Pythagoras marked a spot in Crete where reposed the remains of Zeus. Here lieth in death Zan, whom men call Zeus. This conflict between immortality and death is easily explained if the fact is borne in mind that in some districts of Crete he was, like Hyacinthos in Laconia, a god of vegetation who alternately lived and died, while in Phrygia his descriptive title of summer god carried substantially the same significance. The marriages of Zeus. Zeus is represented as the most uxorious of all the gods. Of his almost countless unions with goddesses and women, many were accepted by the Greeks with the absence of comment, which, as a rule, is the sanction of legitimacy. But they looked askance at a number of others in a way which made them, to say the least, the objects of social suspicion. In the Hesiodic tradition, the first marriage of Zeus was with Metis and his last with Hera, while in that of the older epic, Hera was his first and only legitimate wife. At all events, Hera became his canonical wife in Greek, and later as Juno in Roman myth. But the portrayal of their conjugal relationship we shall postpone to our discussion of the personality of Hera. His marriages with Metis, Themis, Mnemosyne, and Eurynome were probably simply poetical, and through the influence of suggestion added to the conception of his dignity and power. The symbolism is evident in itself. On receiving a warning that a son of Metis, or constructive thought, would be more powerful than his father Zeus, he swallowed her and assimilated her into his own being. Themis, or Justice, he married after the defeat of the Titans and incorporated her personality into his regime. Mnemosyne, or Memory, he made his wife as a constant reminder, to others of course, of his great might. And his affiliation with Eurynome, or Wide Rule, emphasized the extent of his dominions. Besides the foregoing, the most important goddesses with whom he was united were Dione, who may have been his spouse in Pelasgic times, Demeter, the mother of Persephone, Leto, the mother of Apollo and Artemis, and Maia, the mother of Hermes, while Pyrrha and Dia, who also became his wives, are probably two aspects of the earth goddess. The chief nymphs with whom he was associated were Tygate of the Lake Diamond Mountain, Aegina of the island which bears her name, and Pluto of Lydia. Of his wives among women of purely human or of partly divine descent, we can mention only Io, Leda, Danae, Europe, Iodama, Antiope, Semele, and Alcmene. The offspring of Zeus. No children of any other god but Zeus ever attained to places in the divine circle. Poseidon, Hera, and Hades were of the same titanic parentage as Zeus himself, but Athene, Apollo, Artemis, Ares, Aphrodite, Hephaestus, Hermes, Dionysos, Heracles, Persephone, and the Dioscuri were all his children. Of the race of the heroes mainly claimed him as father, notably Helen, the founder of the Hellenic stock. Minos and his brothers Sarpedon and Rhadamanthus, Dardanos, Tantalos, and Iacchos, heads of the families chiefly concerned in the War of Troy. Lake Diamond, the first of the Lake Diamond strain. Perseus, the demigod of the Argolid, and Amphion, Zethos, and Thebe, who were concerned with the beginnings of Thebes. The functions of Zeus as supreme god. In Zeus's sphere of action as the supreme god, we must distinguish the Zeus of pure myth from the Zeus of serious religious import. In the former, his supremacy is very often encroached upon by the caprices of other divinities, with the result that it is logically annulled. It is the same thing as limiting the absolute. In serious cult, on the contrary, Zeus was the one god, not the only god, but the one god among many subservient gods. This is henotheism as opposed to monotheism. But since much of this aspect has invaded the field of myth, it is precisely this which we must endeavour to note. From Homer to the dramatic poets, the unqualified use of God invariably refers to Zeus, who was the father of gods and men, chiefly in a spiritual and moral sense, in which last capacity it is natural to see in him the ultimate court of appeal for offences against the gods and the higher law, and the final arbiter of punishments. With the great flood he punished mankind for their impiety. To Lycaon's sons he meted out death for their wickedness, and Lycaon himself he changed into a wolf for having essayed to hoodwink a deity. After he had condemned men to earn their bread by their sweat of the brow, none else could alter the decree. Because Tantalus and Sisyphus abused their endowment of knowledge almost divine, he imposed on them terrible penalties in Hades, while Prometheus suffered untold agonies for trespassing on the divine prerogative to fire and for his gratuitous enlightenment of the race of men. For brazen insolence in attempting to scale the walls of Thebes, which his son Amphion had built, Zeus led Capaneus low with a bolt, and he smote Salmoneus in a like manner for invading the divine right of rain-making. He retarded the homecoming of the Argonauts for their part in the murder of Apsitros, the brother of Medea. And finally, so comprehensive was his power, he lessened the population of the earth by making men slaughter one another in the great war of Troy. On the other hand, as the spiritual head of the universe, what better judge could there be than Zeus of the right of heroes or of men to immortality and allied blessings? So it was he who bestowed a special form of immortality on Polydeuces, who sent Cadmos and Harmonia to Elysium, and who uttered the word permitting Prometheus and Charon to exchange mortality and immortality, as Glaucus and Diomedes exchanged bronze and golden armour. It was he, when granted Sarpedon a lifetime 3 generations long. In his power to confer various forms upon men, as he did, for instance, in making Lycaon a wolf, Philyra a linden, and Io a heifer, and in giving the protection of invisibility to his favourites, as he did to the wounded Heracles in Cos, he is not especially differentiated from the other Olympians. Such acts predicate no moral or spiritual power. Zeus as god of the heavens. Although the name Zeus perhaps originally denoted sky, it is only very rarely, notably in a few local cults in Crete, that we find this god brought into connection with any of the celestial luminaries. At first he was probably regarded as the source of all light, that of the heavenly bodies included, and in this circumstance we can find the reason why there was no well-developed native cult of the sun, the moon, and the stars among the Greeks. It is quite possible that those are rare Cretan cults in which Zeus seemed to be a sun god are distant offshoots of a Mesopotamian sun cult. It is in his meteorological functions that Zeus is preeminent in the sky. The rain descends from the sky, therefore it is Zeus, the cloud-gatherer, who dispenses it. And Theocritus mentions the reign of Zeus, while Zeus reigns was a popular saying. It was quite natural then for the demon of the magic rainstones of primitive communities to be confused and even identified with Zeus. And the story of the stone which Rhea gave Cronos to swallow was doubtless derived from some magic rain-making ritual. While, if Zeus was thus the supreme rainmaker, the essential nature of the sin of Salmoneus is manifest. Now, in order to influence the great weather spirit with an immediate directness, one must get as close to him as possible. And what could be nearer to him than the highlands? Hence, the frequency with which we find the cults of Zeus on mountain peaks, on Dicte and Ida in Crete, on Olympus in Thessaly, on Lycaos in Arcadia, or on Kithaeron in Boeotia, while such general epithets as highest of the peaks and of the summits point to his association with great elevations in general. Yet he is god of the thunder and lightning as well as that of the rain. At Mantinea and Olympia he was the lightning itself and not the directing agent, and with the poets he is the mighty thunderer and the hurler of lightning. The lightning and the thunderbolts forged by his smiths, the Cyclopes, were the weapons with which he overthrew the Titans, while Pegasus drew the thunder car for him from the ancient stables of heaven. And with the lightning he separated the battling Heracles and Apollo, and visited sudden death on those who incurred his displeasure. Zeus was also held to be the sender of the dew, which in times of drought was so essential to the welfare of the crops and pasturage. Zeus as god of fertility. It was but an easy step for the god of the rain and the dew to become the god of the fertility produced by these forms of moisture. It seemed to the Greek that with these some fertilizing substance or vital principle fell upon the receptive soil. And who but Zeus was the giver of it? It entered into plants from the soil, and into animals and men from plants, so that the whole cycle of life was dependent on Zeus, who was the great begetter. The native Zeus of Attic was originally a deity of agriculture, as is clearly seen in the ritual of Bouphonia, while such epithets as increaser of fruits, giver of fruitage, and husbandman reveals him as a god of harvest. Zeus in his political and ethical aspects. From the Aristotelian point of view, these two aspects cannot be scanned separately, for ethical standards are nothing else than the crystallized experience of organized society. In both myth and cult, Zeus was the ideal statesman of the Greeks, having had that serenity of judgment which awakens the confidence of the governed. His lordship over himself inspired self-control in those who looked up to him, and the very stains upon his dignity which the myths often revealed gave the legends an air of convincing reality. Yet, in spite of his generally accepted high political estate, we rarely meet with the cult of Zeus ben Hellenios, the Zeus of the United States of Greece, so to speak, for the Greeks' keen sense of local independence never allowed them to realize this ideal in politics. He frequently appeared, however, as the guardian of the family property, of boundaries, of wealth, of the domestic and state hearts severally, and of tribal and family kin. And he was also the patron of the higher social interests collectively and separately, of freedom, of the centralized union of tribes and brotherhoods, and of concord among the people. While he was sometimes qualified by epithets like warlord and bearer of victory, yet he was seldom known purely as a god of war, a testimony to the advanced character of the Greek religion. To such an extent was Zeus the most ethical of all the gods of the pantheon that he almost shrank the Greek polytheism into monotheism, and it was this fact which enabled the Greeks to withstand the inroads of Christianity for so long a time, even though it was the very feature which in the end facilitated the acceptance of the new faith. While Zeus was the bringer of evil as well as of good into the life of men, occasionally the Greeks rose to the noble idea that he was above all that was evil. Being such a god, he was logically at enmity with iniquity, and was driven by an inevitable necessity to chastise it, whence his punishments were not the results of caprice, although their suddenness might often lead one to think that they were. Heracles murdered a friend. His slavery to Omphale was a natural retribution visited on him by the god of friendship. Tantalus took the life of his own son Pelops. His punishment in Hades was a measure of his crime against the guardian of blood kinship. To violations of pledges and of oaths taken in his name, Zeus could give only short shrift. Before the eyes of the spectators at Olympia stood a row of bronze images of Zeus called, in the dialect of Elis, Xanes, or Zeuses, which had been made with the fines imposed on those who had broken the rules governing the great games, and which, in their conspicuous position, were national reminders that Zeus was ever watchful of the fidelity of men in the works of organized society. Zeus as prophet, fate, healer, and helper. At Dodona in Epeiros stood the talking oak of Zeus, which delivered to men messages concerning the future, and a piece of which, we recall, was built into the prow of the Argo, and with human voice spoke to the heroes. It was believed that the tree gave utterance to the thought of Zeus through the whisperings of its foliage, and these were interpreted by skilled priests who made the meanings known to consultants by inscribing them on small plaques of lead. Just why the oak of all the trees was chosen as the vehicle of Zeus's communication, we may never know. But perhaps Sir J. G. Fraser is as near to the truth as is anyone when he claims the oak as the special tree of Zeus because it is more often struck by lightning than any other tree of the forest. The power of Zeus to foretell at least the immediate future by means of the thunder and the lightning we have already pointed out in our consideration of the Zeus of Homer. But he could also reveal his will through the flight of birds across the sky, especially through that of the eagle, which was preeminently his bird. In a certain sense, Zeus as fate exercised a prophetic function. He could foretell because he predestined. In Homer it was he alone who foreordained, and Moira, or fate, was, as it were, an impersonal decree issuing from him. But in the 5th century the idea rapidly gained currency that there was a power performing the future to which Zeus himself must bow. In Aeschylus, accordingly, it is the 3 fates who limit his dominion. But in spite of this, the Homeric belief never wholly died out. One need not seek far for the source of the strength of Zeus as a healer and helper of a weak and feeble humanity, for a god of his broad general powers could do anything in particular, so that we are not surprised to find attached to his name such epithets as defender from ill, bestower of immunity, healer, saviour, and even averter of flies, one of his titles at Olympia. Some scholars claim that the stories of the birth of Dionysos from the thigh of Zeus and of the springing of Athene from his head hark back to an early function of his as a god of childbirth. Zeus as a chthonic divinity. The few instances where Zeus appears as chthonic divinity or deity of the underworld were probably the result of a mistaken identification, or of an extension of function. The Zeus Chthonius of Corinth was a counterpart of Hades, while Zeus Meletios of Attic became a chthonic god through the character of Zeus as a deity of agriculture, and Iacchos of Aegina, a son of Zeus in the legend, seems to have been in origin a local Aeginetan chthonic Zeus. Zeus in art. The maturer periods of Greek art represented Zeus as a fully developed man standing or seated in an attitude suggestive of serene dignity and undisputed power. As a rule, he holds the thunderbolt in his hand, but sometimes a ruler's staff or an image of victory, and occasionally an eagle can be observed at his side. Hera. The origin and the name of Hera. The original significance of the person and of the name of Hera is lost in the obscurity of a remote past. But inasmuch as at all periods she manifested surprisingly few traces of Oriental influences, we are probably not to look to the East for her introduction into Greece. She was certainly very early a pan-Hellenic divinity, though none can say whether she came to the land with the invaders from the north or was a native goddess already established. Her acknowledged antiquity in Argos has led some to suspect that she was there a Pelasgic earth goddess, whom the invaders adopted as their own under the new name of Hera. Yet, this explanation is puzzling in the light of the paucity of Hera's earth functions, for in the historical period she was certainly not of the earth, earthy. Moreover, why was she so implacable a foe of Dionysus? Why did she dispense no oracles? Why, too, had her children, Eris and Hephaestus, no chthonic functions? The hypothesis that she was originally a moon goddess may be summarily dismissed on the ground that it deals with an admittedly late conception. The name Hera seems to have had some connection with that of Heracles and perhaps with hero, but the statement that it signifies the strong one is based without warrant on assumed relations of Hera with the goddess of Phoenicia. Hera in Homer. As in the Theogony of Hesiod, Hera is the daughter of Cronos and Rhea, and sister spouse of Zeus. Indeed, she and Zeus are the only married pair on Olympus, but their conjugal life is anything but smooth, for Hera is far from being a model wife like Andromache or Penelope. Rather, she is a sort of divine Xanthippe. She often nags her husband until his Olympia's patience is exhausted, and fear of such nagging many a time deters him from pursuing courses which his judgment has decided are right and proper. And she has the bad habit of taking the offside of any question which he may favour. She envelopes the Trojans in a mist to detain them when Zeus has willed that they advance. Against the wish of Zeus she hastens the sun westward, and by her guile the birth of Heracles is retarded so that her favourite Eurystheus may gain the upper hand. So persistent is her interference with the actions of Zeus that, humanly speaking, there is no reason for surprise when he cruelly punishes her by hanging her head down from the heights of heaven. Yet, despite all this, she is the noblest of the goddesses, and when she moves on her throne, tremors are felt throughout Olympus, while sometimes she even wields the thunderbolt, and like a husband sends storm and cloud. She is the beautiful divinity of the white arms, and lives in a great luxurious calm. And she is, too, a helpful goddess of childbirth, under whose direction her daughters, the Eleuthiae, control the births of Heracles and Eurystheus. Hera as the wife of Zeus. The holy union of Zeus and Hera, which we have described in our chapter on beginnings, was to all the Greeks the ideal of married existence. And although the Homeric character of Hera as wife persisted in mythology down to a late period, yet her marriage was always popularly held to have been a happy one. This savours, however, more of courtesy than of truth, inasmuch as the Greeks must have felt that with a faulty model before them the stability of their social life was imperilled. the union itself is variously explained. Some are tempted to see it in an affiliation of natural forces, so that, when meteorological elements are concerned, the domestic strife of Zeus and Hera would be interpreted as an allegorical representation of the conflicts of air currents. Yet, this cannot hold if Hera derived her few celestial functions from her long and intimate contact with Zeus. One extremely ingenious theory outlines a very different origin of the union. It points out that as the goddess was most celebrated in the chief Pelasgic centers like Euboea, Boeotia, Argolis, and Samos, it was probably generally accepted in Pelasgic times. In Dodona, however, the oldest Pelasgic center of the cult of Zeus, the wife of Zeus was not Hera but Dione, whence his marriage with Hera must have originated in the same Pelasgic period. But how was it brought about without a fatal wrench of religious sentiment? The myth-makers had a way. If, by means of a myth, Dionysos could be foisted on Zeus as a son, it was surely just as easy to explain away one wife and give him another. The necessity for so doing arose, this theory holds, with the intermingling of two racial stocks, one of which was matrilinear and worshipped Hera as its chief divinity, and the other of which was patrilinear and followed the cult of Zeus. To unite the two divinities in a sacred wedlock would be to secure a religious sanction for the connubial and political fusion of the two strains of blood, and accordingly, Hera was torn from the embrace of her lawful husband, Heracles, and thrown into the arms of a divorced Zeus. The separation being so carefully hushed up, however, that only scanty traces of it are left. The children of Hera and Zeus were Hephaestus, Eris, Hebe, and the Eileithyia, but they exhibit few traits which reveal their maternity. Hephaestus takes his mother's part when Zeus punishes her for her interference, and Zeus himself apologizes for Eris's warlike disposition in that he inherits it from his mother. Hebe is a personification of the well-preserved beauty of a mother, and in one legend she has no relationship at all with Zeus, Hera bearing her after a most mysterious impregnation by a leaf of lettuce. The Eileithyia reflect their mother's care for women in childbed. The functions of Hera. Whether or not Hera was originally a goddess of the weather and fertility, she occasionally appears as such in the myths, and, less often, in her cults. The gale which bore Agamemnon to his home shores after the fall of Ilion was of Hera's making, and she it was, too, who caused the mist to enshroud the Trojans. The cuckoo, often regarded as a rain bird, was sacred to her, and Polycletos represented it perched on her sceptre, while in one brief legend Zeus assumed the form of the cuckoo to win her love. In times of drought, processions of her worshippers would march to the mountain tops and there invoke her aid, and the luxuriant growth of bloom which appeared after a dry period had been broken sprang, people said, from Hera's bridal bed. She was, moreover, protectress of such staple plants as the pomegranate and the vine, the full development of which depends so directly upon the volume of rainfall. Hera's power to cause insanity was notorious. Heracles and Athamas and Ino she impelled in their madness to take the lives of their own offspring. Io she drove mad with a gadfly, and she made the daughters of Proetus roam wildly over the Peloponnesus. Nor did the gods entirely escape, for she cast a spell of frenzy on Dionysos for his introduction of the vine, and under its influence he wandered hither and thither in both the nearer and the farther east. There is a widespread primitive belief that lightning brings madness, and perhaps this, in conjunction with Hera's association with the phenomena of the weather, may have given rise to her special power over lunacy. Throughout the Hellenic peoples, Hera was the chief proctress of women, having surveillance over their part of the conjugal relationships and acting as their helper in the hour of travail, while, by a logical projection of these functions, she was thought to have special care for the well-being of children. She encouraged matrimony and discouraged celibacy. The great crime of the 49 daughters of Danaus lay not in the murder of their husbands, but in their stubborn will to remain single. And the punishment meted out to them in Hades was that imposed on celibates after death, according to certain of the mysteries. Hypermnestra, who spared a husband, seems to have been in origin a priestess of the Argive Heraion. Hera's contact with the higher interests of corporate society was slight. Nowhere outside of Argos, and perhaps Samos, were her political functions conspicuous, and nowhere except in Argos did she have much to do with the arts of civilized existence. Hephaestus, the artisan god, was her son, to be sure, but his gifts defied the laws of heredity. Though the queen of all Olympian goddesses, she possessed much less ethical force than Athene, and contrary to our expectation, it was not she, but the Erinyes, who punished violations of the marriage vow. All this tends to convince one that her personality was not the ideal of the Greek wife, but was a reflection of the restricted conditions of life surrounding the Hellenic matron. Herodotus' story of the death of Cleiboi and Biton is not only effectively told, but shows the Argive faith in Hera as the final judge of what constitutes the summum bonum, that is, as an ethical deity. The father of history tells how a certain woman of the city of Argos planned to ride in her ox cart to the Heraion, some 40 furlongs distant, and when the oxen did not appear, her son Cleobis and Biton put the yoke across their necks and drew her to the temple. Filled with pride at the many felicitations which she received on having such sons, the mother stood before the image of Hera and prayed that she would bestow upon Cleobis and Biton the greatest boon that men could have. After sacrificing and feasting, the young men lay down and slept in the precinct of the goddess, and never woke. It is not a pleasantry based on her matrimonial quarrels when we state that there is some evidence that Hera was regarded as a goddess of war. Traditions to that effect seem to underlie some of the cults, although the only tangible hint of this in myth is found in the story of Heracles, since Alcmaeon's name indicates that she was primitively a divinity of war, and her close association with Hera through her son may mean that she was actually Hera herself. Hera in art. The Hera of art lacks the clear-cut attributes of personality belonging to the Hera of myth and cult. She has no sure tag of identification about her representations, such as Artemis has in her bow and Athene in her aegis, although at a late period she occasionally had a peacock beside her. In her great statue in the Argive Heraion, the work of Polykleitos, she was shown holding a pomegranate in one hand, and on the top of her staff, held in the other hand, perched a cuckoo. She generally appeared as a beautiful mature woman, with or without a veil, seated on a throne. Chapter 2. The Greater Gods. Athene. The origin and the name of Athene. The most that one can say of the origin of Athene is that she belonged to the so-called Achaean period and was worshipped by Dorian and Ionian alike, while her cult was diffused uniformly over the entire Greek world. No observable traces of a Pelasgic descent cling to her person, although she may have been Pelasgic. Equally lacking are marks of her importation from the Orient. This we confidently assert in the face of apparently well-supported statements that she, along with Hera, was an offshoot of the Philistine goddess Asah of Gaza, and her identification at Corinth with the Syro-Arabian goddess Allat was a mere accident. The main lines of a character and the forms of a worship observed, for instance, in Tegea, Sparta, Cyrene, Rhodes, and Athens, were all developed primarily in Argos. But of all these places, Athens alone added new traits and stimulated the logical unfolding of old ones, so that, for this reason, it is in Athens that we can study Athene to the greatest advantage. As for the meaning of a name, here again we must confess to ignorance, although one suggested etymology is at least worth consideration. This derives her appellation from without mother's milk, and interprets it either passively or actively, the reference in the former sense being to Athene's unmothered birth from Zeus, and in the latter to her sexless character, which is much like that of the Amazons. Athene in Homer. Homer constantly depicts Athene as the beloved daughter of Zeus, but nowhere does he allude to her birth from his head. She is more like the chief Olympian than is any one of the other divinities, male or female, not only resembling him in the wide range and directness of her activities as well as in the high type of her mentality, but also possessing a large measure of her father's spontaneous resourcefulness in crisis. By reason of her ready wit, she has a natural affinity for Odysseus, and, on the principle that God helps those who help themselves, stands ready at all times to assist him. She is the patroness and model worker of all those arts of life which demand ingenuity and dexterity. She is skilled in the smithing of gold, in weaving and other domestic accomplishments. She endowed Penelope and the daughters of Pandareos with their skill in all handiwork, and she it was, too, who gave deftness to the thought and hand of Epios in fashioning the wooden horse, the instrument of Troy's fall. While she frequently takes sides in the actual strife before Troy, she does so rather as a great strategist than as one who delights in carnage and havoc. The birth of Athene. In the Theogony of Hesiod, we are told that Orenos and Gaia warned Zeus that his wife Metis, then pregnant with Pallas, would bear a son who would become the king of gods and men. Keeping his counsel to himself, Zeus approached Metis and craftily persuaded her to assume the form of some very small animal. A late legend says that she became a fly, whereupon he promptly swallowed her, and, after a time, Pallas Athene leaped forth from his head in a panoply of gold. And mighty Olympus shook dreadfully beneath the fearful bright-eyed goddess, and round about earth loudly re-echoed. The sea was moved, being stirred with purple waves. Suddenly the spray was thrown aloft, and the glorious son of Hyperion halted his swift steeds, till such time as the maiden Pallas Athene had removed her divine armour from her immortal shoulders. And all counselling Zeus rejoiced. In a variant form of this myth, Brontes, one of the Cyclopes, begat Athene by Metis, who was swallowed by Zeus before she could bring her offspring into the world. And in other stories she is the daughter of Pallas, or of a sea nymph, Coryph, by either Zeus or Poseidon. The canonical myth of her birth seems to have been invented very early to account for her already established traits of wisdom and moral sense, while the legend in which Coryph mothers her is apparently an outgrowth of a cult title, which commemorated her birth from the head of Zeus. It is not impossible that in the first place Metis was Athene herself. The functions of Athene. The Athene of myth and worship alike was a goddess of practical and not of speculative life. None but a utilitarian philosophy could spring from contemplation of her being, and there was very little symbolism in her rites. She neither personified nor controlled any special department of nature, although, as occasion required, she could work in a number of them. In her mature development, she was the social deity par excellence, unmarred by many of the primitive crudities which still clung to the distinctively nature gods. Athene was the inventress and craftswoman among the Olympians, and in that capacity was associated with Hephaestus and Prometheus. It was she who contributed the soul to the fashioning of Pandora, and she invented the plough, and first contrived spinning, weaving, and working in metal. To artisans she gave special thought. Phereclos, the builder of the ships of Paris, she loved above all men, and she herself assisted in the building of the Argo. It was said that she invented the flute, and with it imitated the wails of the two surviving Gorgons as they lamented over the body of their sister Medusa. And although this story seems to be a fiction to account for only a certain motive on the flute, yet elsewhere Athene was credited with the invention of flute music in general. The honours of having contrived the Pyrrhic dance were indefinitely divided between Athene and the Corites. Some claimed that she originated it to celebrate the victory over the Titans. She was the first to subdue horses to human use, and for their control devised the bit and bridle, while from her hands Bellerophon received the bridle with which he guided Pegasus. It was as a divinity of skill rather than of the sea that she exercised a patronage over seamanship and gave success to the Athenian marine. And she it was who safely steered the Argo past the perilous Symplegades. In Attic, Athene was active in another practical field, that of agriculture. She was especially associated with the olive, and it was in Salamis, where first from the earth the grey gleaming fruit of the maiden Athena had birth. After creating the olive, she revealed its uses to mankind. She and Poseidon contested the ownership of Attic, and a decision was promised by arbiters to that one of the two who would confer the greatest benefit upon the citizens. Whereupon Poseidon, with a stroke of his trident, produced the salt spring, and Athene planted the olive tree, both on the Acropolis. The land was awarded to Athene, and from her gift were grown the olive orchards of the Attic plain. Her associations with agriculture in general seem not to have been original, but, as it were, a legacy of an earlier agricultural divinity whom she displaced. The serpent in the Erythaion and the obscene fertility rites hinted at in the story of Erythonius's birth from Athene apparently go back to such a divinity. As a war goddess, Athene was much the same outside of Homer as within, and her attitude was that of a defender rather than that of a provoker of war. She took her part in the just defense of Zeus from the attack of the Titans, her special antagonist in this conflict being Enceladus, and she directed particular attention to the development of efficiency in the cavalry and to difficult siege operations. A branch of her olive was an emblem of peace won by arms. Although Athene provoked the storm that scattered the Achaeans departing from Ilion, although she shattered the ship of Aias with a lightning bolt and aided Odysseus time and again with favourable changes of wind and weather, she cannot be regarded as decidedly a weather goddess, her activities in this sphere doubtless coming from her intimate relationship to Zeus. Most of Athene's social aspects have been brought out incidentally in the foregoing discussion of her attributes. Occasionally, however, she appeared as the patroness of the deliberative and executive branches of the state, and as Athene Polias in Athens, she was the divine mainstay of the entire body politic. Her outstanding moral characteristic is her unimpeachable chastity, so that on Tegea she brought a plague because Og's babe, born out of wedlock, had been concealed in her precinct. while her anger against the son of Oileus was aroused more by his offense against a general moral law protecting suppliants than by the desecration of a shrine in particular. Athene in art. There are two outstanding types of representations of Athene. In the first, which is the more common, she is shown standing with lance and shield, wearing a helmet, and carrying the aegis with the gorgoneion, or Gorgon's head. In the other type, she is seated and unarmed. In both, the owl and the snake sometimes appear as distinctive attributes. Chapter 3. The Greater Gods. Leto, Apollo, Artemis, Hecate. Leto. Leto, or Latin Latona, was the daughter of the Titans Coeus and Phoebe. In Homer, she was already held to be the mother of Apollo and Artemis, and, in more than a transient sense, the spouse of Zeus. When Aeneas was wounded, she assisted in caring for him, but her act is not to be regarded as significant of a religious function, for her chief importance lies in her motherhood of Apollo and Artemis. The birth of Apollo and Artemis. The story of the birth of Apollo and Artemis can be made complete by piecing together a portion of a Homeric hymn to Apollo and several supplementary myths. The statement in one of the latter that Artemis was born the day before Apollo must be held in mind as an explanation of her presence at her brother's birth. Being great with child by Zeus, Leto wandered from land to land about the Aegean, searching for a place in which to bring her son to the light. But everywhere the people feared his predestined power, and she was turned cruelly away. At last she reached the island of Rhenea, and at her own request was taken from there to Delos, which she earnestly begged to afford her the refuge that she so much needed. After long hesitation, the island consented to receive her on condition that she would swear a solemn oath that her son's first shrine would be erected there, and that he would abundantly honor and not despise this unproductive tract of rock. Leto swore by the Styx, the most awful of all oaths, and was forthwith received. Then her birth pangs began, enduring for 9 days and 9 nights, but with no result, although she was helped by Artemis, Themis, Amphitrite, and other divinities, until finally these sent for Eileithyia, who, hastening to Delos, soon consummated the birth. The attending goddesses cared for the infant Apollo, wrapping him in fine linen, and Themis gave him nectar and ambrosia. As soon as the divine food put strength into him, up he leaped, burst his bands, suddenly attained the stature of a man, and taking the zither and the bow and arrows into his hands, strode to the summit of Mount Kinthos, while the whole island gleamed with a golden light. The union of Leto and Apollo as thus set forth seems to have been founded on some local cult association of the two divinities, and that between Leto and Artemis probably developed from a similarity in function as helpers of women in travail and as a protectress of children, the wandering of Leto being symbolic of this so far as it depicts her as retarding or an advancing birth at will. Leto and Tityos. Leto and Niobe. Travelers on their way to Apollo's shrine at Delphi were often waylaid by a brutal giant named Tityos, and when Leto was once bound thither, he attempted lustful violence upon her. Both to avenge his mother and to aid peaceful pilgrims, Apollo slew Tityos, who was condemned in the underworld to pay a horrible penalty for his crimes. For her insolence in boasting that immortal children were superior to the immortal offspring of Leto, Niobe was changed into a figure of stone, and her children were slain by the arrows of Apollo and Artemis. Apollo. The origin and the name of Apollo. Apollo, the brightest and the most complex creation of polytheism, seems to have been originally the leading god of a people who migrated into Greece from the north in prehistoric times, his northern origin being apparently reflected in the fixed routes followed by the sacred processions to his two chief shrines. The one way, which we may note, Apollo himself followed, according to the longer Homeric hymn in his honor, ran southward from Tempe through Iolcos and Thebes to Delphi, and the other led the pilgrims bearing the Hyperborean fruits overland, along the coast of the Adriatic to Dodona, thence eastward to the Gulf of Euboea, and from that point by ship to Delos. Apollo's initial function is by no means certain, nor has any satisfactory explanation of the source and meaning of his name yet been offered. Apollo in Homer. In Homer, Apollo is already the son of Zeus and the brother of Artemis, but although his chief physical traits and the leading features of his character are fixed, he has yet to evolve the complex personality by which he is to be known to the Greeks after the 5th century BC. He has to do with light, but is not convincingly identified with Helios. He is a god of healing, but not yet the god of healing, so that he revives Hector after he has been wounded in conflict. With the power of healing must be assumed its opposite, the ability to inflict harm, whence it was Apollo who, in consequence of a slight, sent the pestilence upon the men and beasts of the Achaean camp. He is himself the expert archer of the Olympians and confers on Pandora's and Teucros skill in the use of the bow. But, though he wields the bow and occasionally takes part in the strife as a violent partisan of the Trojans, he is only accidentally a god of war. He is associated with prophecy in that seers, like cultures, draw their inspirations from him. Descriptions of him always represent him as in the prime of young manhood, with flowing locks of golden hair. Apollo in Delphi. Python, the huge dragon offspring of Earth, learned that he was doomed to die at the hands of a son whom Leto should bear, and to forestall the future he sought to kill her, but was frustrated by Zeus, who removed her to a place of safety until her children were born. Soon after his birth, Apollo took from Hephaestus a quiver of arrows, and with them slew his mother's foal at Delphi, thereby earning for himself the title Pythios, and, bearing the body of the python in the temple, he instituted over it funeral games, which were thereafter known as the Pythian Games. Closely allied with this legend is the account which, in the Homeric hymn dedicated to the god, tells of his founding of his own shrine. Leaving Olympus, Apollo pressed southward, passing through Iolcos, Euboea, and Thebes, and at last came to Delphi, on the slopes of Mount Parnassus overlooking the Gulf of Corinth, where he built a beautiful temple from which to deliver oracles, he himself laying the foundation, but entrusting the rest to the work to human hands. Hard by the fane was a spring where lurked Typhon, a destructive monster, unlike both gods and men, which Hera begot without Zeus in answer to her prayer that earth grant her a son who would overthrow her husband. With one of his sharp shafts Apollo laid Typhon low, and because he left the carcass upon the ground to rot, the deity was called Pythias, if a play upon words can convince anyone. In these two narratives we may perceive indications that the earth goddess had a mantic seat at Delphi before the cult and oracle of Apollo were established there, this being partially verified by the story that Earth, jealous of Apollo's usurpation, sent dream oracles to visitors at the fane to thwart the Apolline method of revealing the future. Whereupon the god appealed to Zeus, who ordered that no more prophecies of this type be dispensed in the shrine. When Apollo had completed his temple, the Homeric hymn continues, he cast about for suitable priests to serve him, and, spying a company of Cretans in a ship bound for Pylos, he leaped into the sea in the form of a dolphin, and thence into the hollow of the vessel. None durst touch or disturb him, and, as long as he lay there, the sailors lost all control of their helm, so that, in spite of themselves, they were carried past their goal and eastward up the Gulf of Corinth until they came to Crisa, the port of Delphi. There Apollo, in the form of a beautiful youth, revealed himself to them, and, appointing them the holy servitors of his temple, bade them worship him thenceforth under the title Delphinios, or dolphin-like. The site of the shrine, formerly called Pytho, being now given the name of Delphi. This legend apparently records a historical fact that the Delphinian Apollo, who was widely regarded as a savior from shipwreck, was of Cretan provenance. The functions of Apollo. Undoubtedly, the best-known power of Apollo was that of prophecy. As has already been clearly intimated, his chief prophetic shrine was Delphi, although other centers, probably offshoots of Delphi, like Branchidae, were found in various places. His foreknowledge was consulted in all sorts of matters. Aegeus and later Creusa and Southos sought it in reference to offspring. Heracles, regarding a cure for the dreadful malady which afflicted him. Cadmos, in order to find the lost Europe. The Epigonoi were assured through it of the ultimate victory of their cause against Thebes, and Alcmaeon used it as a sanction for the murder of his mother Eriphyle. In historical times, the oracle was consulted time and again, and although many of the more enlightened Greeks, Thucydides, for instance, frankly held the popular confidence in the oracle to be pure superstition, they did not question the value of Delphi as essential to the maintenance of Greek political and moral unity. The story of Cassandra reflects the oracular powers of Apollo. It seems that Apollo desired her to yield him her love, but she refused, although he promised to endow her in return with the gift of foreseeing the future, whereupon, to punish the obstinate maiden, he gave her the promised boon, but added to it the penalty that her prophecies would never be believed. Inasmuch as the oracle was most commonly consulted concerning the healing of disease, it was easy for Apollo to become a god of healing. If he was originally a divinity light, this function becomes more readily understood, for the ancients were well aware of the purifying nature of light, and moreover the physician has always been regarded as a sort of compound of seer and healer. As healer, Apollo was known under many names, notably that of Paean, and it is probable that the purpose of the Paean hymn sung before battle and after victory was to invoke healing for the wounds of conflict. Apollo was the divine guardian of navigation, a function which seems to have had its root not in any special lordship over the sea, but in the wide diffusion of his cult in all Hellenic settlements. He exercised control not so much over the sea as over those elements and physiographical features which make for the convenience and safety of voyages, trade winds, harbours, estuaries, and the like. From the highways of the ocean, his supervision was naturally extended to the highways of the land, and he became the protector of wayfarers, whence the presence of his images in the streets before house doors. The role of Apollo as the divine founder of colonies is doubtless as early as the period of the immigration which brought him into the Hellenic world. As the years went by, this part was greatly enlarged through the frequency with which prospective colonists appealed to his oracle to throw light on the destiny of their settlements abroad. And epithets like founder point to this. He was even said to guide emigrants to their new homes in the form of some bird, especially of a seabird, such as the diver or the gull, and he came himself, in one account, to Delphi from the land of the Hyperboreans in a chariot drawn by swans. In just such a car he conveyed Kyrene to Africa, and we have already noted how, as a dolphin, he led his ministers to his shrine in Delphi. Owing to this intimate connection with the establishing of new states, his name easily became woven into the genealogies of their human founders, so that, for instance, as Petrus, he was literally known in Athens as the flesh and blood father of Aeon by the Athenian maiden Creusa. Now, it was logical to expect the founder to continue his favor past the initial stages of settlement and to ensure the well-being of the establishment community. Whence we find Apollo as the protector and ideal of youth, that is, of the citizens-to-be, in which connection it will be remembered that Heracles dedicated to him a lock of his hair on attaining to manhood. We see him, too, protecting all useful plants as well as herds. As Mintheus, he saves the crops from the ravages of mice. The Carnanian Apollo of Lake Diamond was a god of horned cattle, and Apollo himself herded the flocks of Admetos for a season. Of the trees, the laurel, apple, and tamarisk were sacred to him. His relation to the laurel is dimly pictured in the story that Apollo loved Daphne, the daughter of the river Peneus and Earth, but, evading his embrace, the maiden besought her mother to save her. Earth, hearkening to the prayer, allowed her to sink partly from sight and changed her into the laurel tree, whereupon, breaking off a branch, Apollo crowned his head with it. Although Hermes was credited with the invention of the lyre, Apollo was the skilled performer upon it. In myth, he is but rarely represented as employing the flute, a pictorial manner of saying that the wailing notes of this instrument were not in harmony with the Apolline ritual, and the superiority of the lyre is the substance of the story of the contest between Apollo and Marsyas. Athene, it is said, invented the flute out of a deer's horn and played before the gods, but her grimaces created such ridicule that in disgust she threw the instrument away and cursed with torture whosoever would pick it up. Marsyas the satyr found it, and having, by dint of much practice, attained great proficiency, he boastfully challenged Apollo to a contest in which the Muses, as judges, awarded the palm to the god, who, in fulfillment of Athene's curse, proceeded to flay his defeated adversary alive. Besides being a performer on the lyre and the flute, Apollo was a singer, and, in short, he was the god of all music and of the allied art of poetry. Bards drew their inspiration from him, and it was he who impelled the priests and priestesses of the oracles to cast their utterances into measured language having the form, if not always the spirit, of poetry. Before the assemblies of the gods he led the chorus of the Muses, and in certain late philosophical beliefs the harmony not only of the movements of the sun but also of the universe was attributed to him. No straining of the fancy is required to follow him as he advances from this exalted position of abstract thought to the lordship of all social harmony. The recognition of Apollo as Helios was early but not original, and may have arisen from Oriental influences, and from this, perhaps, came the conception of his long fair hair, while either here or in his affiliation with Artemis lies the origin of his errors. In spite of his dexterity with the bow, he was never technically a god of war, being, on the contrary, consistently just as he was represented on the western pediment of the temple of Zeus at Olympia, the exponent of peace and civilization as opposed to the ceaseless strife of barbarism. Apollo in art. In representing Apollo, archaic art borrowed from the epic the feature of the unshorn hair, and added it to the rough fetishistic images of the god in order to produce bodily reality. From this was easily evolved the type of the best period, a type which we must forbear from reading into the epic. Here, Apollo was depicted as a young man in his prime, nude or lightly clad, standing or striding. Sometimes he wears a long flowing cloak or a tunic, and the bow, the zither, and the twig of laurel in the hair are almost constant attributes, singly or jointly. Artemis. The origin and the name of Artemis. Artemis may have originated among the Greeks, or, on the other hand, among Phrygians or other barbarians, and later have received a Greek name. Conjectures as to her primeval functions are sharply divided, the two aspects selected by opposing schools as the oldest being first, that in which she interests herself in the life of the world, and secondly, that in which she appears as a destroyer of life. Her cult title, Meleagros, or Hunter of Members, is thought to describe her as the demon of a disease, perhaps of leprosy, which slowly devours the members of the body. By a very natural converse manner of reasoning, the one who could destroy could also arrest the process of destruction and could heal. Yet, for Artemis to acquire from these functions her dominion over the world, we must admit, taxes the fancy and reason, so that it seems much more probable that a divinity who has oversight, among other things, of wild plants with medicinal properties would become a divinity of healing, and that, once the capacity of curing disease was established, the converse process of argument would explain a capacity for destruction. At any rate, her cult must be very old, exhibiting, as it does, remnants of totemism in the ritual eating of the goddess in the flesh of a quail or of a bear, as well as traces of human sacrifice in the slaughter of strangers in the land of the Taurians. Although Artemis enjoyed a pan-Hellenic cult, the oldest Hellenic conception of her was Boeotian. Yet, her matured personality is not purely Hellenic, for her alien characteristics are many. The Artemis of Ephesus, for instance, is a hybrid of the Great Mother, the maternal principle of nature, and the original Greek goddess. And she not only acquired traits from the Cretan Rhea, but was identified with the barbarian Dictina, Britomartis, Bendis, Anaitis, Astarte, and Atargatis. The source of her association with Apollo is unknown, though some accidental local contact may be suspected. Her appellation appears to be connected with the root of the name Arcadia, but we are in the dark as to its meaning. Artemis in Homer. Artemis takes next to no part in the action of the Homeric poems, most mentions of her being merely allusions to her activities in the various localities in Hellas prior to the Trojan War. Her personality is marked by three outstanding features. She is a huntress and the mistress of wild life, a bringer of sudden death, and the virgin sister of Apollo. Through instruction received from her, the Trojan Scamandros learned to hunt the beasts of hill and woodland, and she herself was set to roam the ranges of Taygetos and Erymanthos, delighting in the wild boars and swift hinds. She was the slayer of Orion, a daughter of Bellerophon, and of the daughters of Niobe. and when women died of a sudden but peaceful death, people said that they were the victims of a swift arrows. The functions of Artemis. The traits which have just been mentioned, with others added, still cling to Artemis in the field of myth beyond Homer, while her relation to the vast tracts beyond the settlements of men can be observed in her almost certain identity with Callisto, Atlante, the mountain nymph Taygete, and Kyrene, under whose name she became the mother of Aristaios by Apollo. The Kyrenian doe, which Heracles captured alive, was sacred to her, and for killing another of her sacred hinds, Agamemnon was sorely punished, and his fleet was detained at Aulis by headwinds, while it was she who placed a hind on the Aulid altar in lieu of the innocent Iphigenia. Callisto in the form of a bear fell before her bow, and the unerring spear and dog were given to Procris through her goodwill, if we follow a particular version of the legend. One of her shrines, we are told, was surrounded by a veritable zoological garden, and in her capacity as protectress of such collections may perhaps be found the origin of her common epithet, Lady of the Beasts. Of the birds, the quail, the partridge, the guinea fowl, and the swallow were intimately related to her cult, but only rarely did domestic animals like the horse, the ox, and the sheep come within the scope of her supervision, although in this connection we may call to mind the failure of Atreus to keep his promise to sacrifice to her the golden lamb. With all beasts, her protecting function comes first and the destroying second. As a huntress and in her general oversight of wild nature, she contracted affiliations with Dionysos and the Menids, and was thought to be the same as the Cretan Dictina, while in the old Boeotian culture she was held to be the hunting partner of Orion, together with whom she shot her sharp arrows at man and beast alike. Not unnaturally, she was a goddess of plant life, primarily that of the untilled lands, the trees of the forest, for instance, being sacred to her. Yet, she must also have had an interest in the plants of tillage, else the stories of her pick at the harvest home, sacrifices of Oenos and Admetus have no point. As the goddess physician, Artemis had broad functions, and no hard and fast line can be drawn about the kinds of ailments under her control. Malarial chills, leprosy, rabies, gout, epilepsy, phthisis, and mental diseases are all mentioned as coming within the range of her activities, and she even undertook to heal snake bites. Her methods of treatment savour strangely of magic, particularly of that branch known as homeopathic, a circumstance which may be counted as good proof of her antiquity as a healer. The quail, partridge, guinea fowl, goat, swine, and the fabulous hippocamp were included in her materia medica, and, among plants, the juniper and the white and the black hellebore, the healing property in all these being Artemis herself, who, counteracting the power of Artemis, the cause of the disease, effected a cure by virtue of the famous principle, here to be interpreted, of course, in a magical sense, of similia similibus curantur. Like is cured by like. Bathing in certain lakes and streams near her shrines, as in the Alpheus of Elis, was supposed to remove some diseases, the process to be understood obviously being that of magical ablution. It was apparently through her contact with magic that she entered into connection with Hecate. One of the oldest powers of Artemis was that of expediting the delivery of women in childbirth, and by a contradictory manner of reasoning no longer strange to us, she was also regarded as both bringing and healing puerperal fever. In her exercise of these functions, one can see why she was so closely bound to Leto. The icy chastity of Artemis has long been proverbial, yet it is a fact that only in myth was she endowed with this trait, for no traces of it are to be found in her public cults. The myths which record her puritanical rejection of the almost innocently unchaste Procris, her inordinate punishment of the peeping Actaeon, and her well-nigh Phrasiac patronage of the precocious Hippolytus have the air of being comparatively late attempts to cloak an originally unmoral character with moral attributes, to make a virtue out of an accident. But her chastity is inconsistent with her great interest in maternity and with her impersonation by Atlante and others. Artemis had a number of miscellaneous attributes which we can only mention here. On rare occasions she appears as a water goddess, being invoked, for instance, in the search of springs, while as a protectress of travellers and emigrants she seems to have absorbed some of the duties of Apollo. In the story of Iphigenia at Aulis, she exercised control over the conditions of the weather, and although she was not equated with the moon until a comparatively late period, this identification has become one of her ineradicable marks in poetry. The links binding her to the higher intellectual and social life are slender, yet they exist. Artemis in art. One of the two oldest types of Artemis delineates her with spreading wings and as holding a lion in her hand, while the other shows her between two lions, both of these forms exhibiting Asiatic influence. The fully developed Artemis of art is a huntress, just emerging from maidenhood into womanhood, equipped with bow and quiver, and followed by one or more dogs. Hecate. The great prevalence of the cults of Hecate in the northern districts of Greece, her resemblance to the goddess Bendis of Thrace, and certain other features point convergently towards some northern land as her first home. If she were actually of Hellenic origin, her cult must have died out and after a long period have been revived at the very threshold of the historical era. Her name may be a Greek equivalent of some title borne by her in her native habitat. It appears to be connected with far, and may be a short form of designating her as the far shooter, or as the one who comes from afar. Hecate was grudged free entry into the domain of myth, and was denied an established pedigree, facts which cast suspicion on her alleged Greek nativity. In Hesiod, she was the daughter of the Titan Persis and Asteria, and in Mosaios, the daughter of Zeus and Asteria. A Thessalian myth speaks of Admetos and a woman of Pherae as her parents, although elsewhere her mother was said to be the night or Leto. Strangely, no stock looks back at her as its divine foremother, and Homer seems to have been ignorant of her, for otherwise her strong connection with the underworld would have necessitated a mention of her in the description of the descent of Odysseus to Hades. In one account of the war of the gods and giants, however, Hecate kills the giant Clytius with burning brands. In the Theogony of Hesiod, Hecate is already a fully formed and fully endowed divinity, exercising control equally over heaven, earth, and sea. But the very extravagance of the attributions brands the passage as almost certainly an interpolation, composed by a defender of a cult when it was yet new in Boeotia. Her most conspicuous, and perhaps her original function, was chthonic. Among the goddesses, she stands in substantially the same relation to sorcery and necromancy as does Hermes among the gods, and in myth Medea is one of her priestesses. To modern readers, Hecate is best known as the original Diana of the Crossways, and she was supposed to drive evil influences away from crossways, doors, and gates. To retain her favour, or to placate her anger and that of the hordes of revenants which trooped after her, people used to make offerings to her, commonly known as Hecate's suppers, at the forks of roads, her special haunts, these being given at night under a new moon, and consisting of foods prepared according to a ritual bill of fare. Not until the middle of the 5th century BC was Hecate established as the moon goddess, an identity which she doubtless acquired and maintained through the insecure position of Selene, the lunar divinity proper, in popular belief. This feature and her connection with childbirth she held in common with Artemis. The most widely disseminated type of Hecate in art is one that goes back to the image made for her shrine at the entrance to the Athenian Acropolis, over which she had surveillance. This portrays her as having 3 bodies, all back to back, one facing forward and the other 2 to the left and right respectively. In the outer hands of the side figures are held a pitcher and a deep sacrificial saucer, while each of the remaining 4 hands grasped a torch. It was probably in this form, capable of looking 3 ways at once, that she was popularly conceived as the divine protectress of crossroads. Chapter 4. The Greater Gods. Ares. The origin and the name of Ares. So obscure is the origin of Ares that we are scarcely in a position even to entertain a suspicion as to whether he came from within or from without Hellas. Certainly, his cult was most deeply rooted in Boeotia and farther north. Yet, this cannot be taken as an indication of origin, since we cannot prove that he had been established here longer than elsewhere. His name has a Hellenic cast, but it cannot be satisfactorily derived, although it appeals strongly to the imagination to connect it with a curse. By that token war, the province of Ares would be the curse par excellence. Ares and Homer. Throughout Homer, Ares is the only god whose one thought and task it is to wage war. Yet, it is not the strategic element for which he stands, but rather, as one writer aptly puts it, the blind berserker rage of battle. Beating wildly about him with his blade, he achieves but little glory before Troy, although, unlike any other god, he does succeed in slaying some mortals with his own hand. He is sorely wounded by the hero Diomedes, and in his great pain bellows like an army 10,000 strong. While Homer says that Otos and Ephialtes, the stalwart sons of Aleus, once bound him in a bronze vessel for 13 months, and in a conflict among the gods he is overthrown by Athene. He is as fickle as he is blustering, one moment favouring the Greeks and the next instant lending aid to the Trojans. He is the son of Zeus and Hera, and his father takes pains, perhaps facetiously, to let it be known that his love of brawling is purely a maternal inheritance. His brother is Ares, or strife, and Deimos, or panic, and Phobos, and fear are his steeds. Soldiers are known as his servants, and the bolder heroes as his sons. And by Menotimoi, his name often stands for war or the spirit of strife in arms. Homer records that he was detected in an intrigue with Aphrodite. Ares outside of Homer. Although Ares generally passed as the son of Zeus and Hera, one account, apparently of ancient origin, made him the unfathered offspring of Hera alone after she had become impregnated by plucking a certain flower. The parallel instance of the conception of Hebe will naturally occur to us here. We have already seen how, in the Attic cycle of myths, Ares became associated with Aeropagos through Alcippe, his daughter by Aglaus, and through the group of his professionally belligerent daughters, the Amazons. All of his children reflect his character in some way. Aeneas, the king of Skyros, was his son by Ariadne. Lycurgus, who drove the votaries of Dionysos into the sea, Kyknos, the wrestler, and the Bistonian Diomedes were other offspring. Harmonia, the unhappy mother of a strife-rent family, was born to him by Aphrodite, and the Theban dragon slain by Cadmos was also his issue. Prior to the great assault against the city of Thebes, the 7 generals of the Argive host took the oath binding them to a united cause by dipping their hands in bull's blood caught in the hollow of a shield as they pronounced the names of Ares, Enyo, and Phobos. The ethical influence of Ares was negative and therefore slight, and depended entirely on the interference that his scant popularity must indicate general disapproval of his works and character. Ares in art. An ideal type of Ares in art was apparently never definitely established. In the earlier period, he is generally shown on vases as a fully armed and bearded warrior. There are several types in extant statuary bearing the influence of the later period, the best known being the so-called Borghese Ares of the Louvre, where he is a nude youth wearing a helmet and gazing dreamingly before him. Chapter 5. The Greater Gods, Hermes. The origin and the name of Hermes. Hermes was found in all Hellenic communities, but the part which he played was relatively inferior. Only in 2 or 3 localities had his cult any deep foundation in the history and thought of the people, and in Arcadia alone was he accounted a divine ancestor. Although his name seems to be Greek in external form, it has not yielded to investigators any radical connection with the Greek language, and, a fortiori, any meaning consistent with the character of Hermes. Scholars are practically unanimous in their belief that the deity is not Hellenic, and most of the theories which they venture to make point to the East, a very recent theory supported, as it is, by the tangible evidence of the monuments, making it almost certain that Hermes and his distinctive attributes, the caduceus, came to Hellas apparently by a circuitous path from the Mesopotamian valley. Hermes in Homer. Homer alludes to Hermes as the son of Maia, but fails to state the name of his father. The god is already endowed with the individuality that marks him in later centuries. He is the herald and messenger of the gods. It is he who communicates to Calypso the command of Zeus to free Odysseus, and who bears the scepter from Zeus to Pelops. And by him Priam is safely escorted to the encampment of the Greeks. His conduct of the slain suitors to the halls of Hades is the only instance of Homer of his function as the marshal of departed souls. The converse of this aspect is seen in the assistance which he gives to Heracles to return from the lower to the upper world. As the patron of thieves, he confers on Autolycus, the maternal grandfather of Odysseus, the allied gifts of thievery and falsehood, and he is, moreover, the special divinity of servants and the giver of wealth. Myths of the birth and boyhood of Hermes. A summary of the Homeric hymn to Hermes will give us the best conspectus of the later Greeks' idea of Hermes. After dalliance with Zeus, in love not quite legitimate, the nymph Maia bore Hermes in a cavern on Mount Kyllene in Arcadia. Even for a god, the child was extraordinarily precocious, for, during the morning of the very day of his birth, he walked unaided out of the grotto, inquisitive to see what the world was like. Immediately he espied a tortoise, and, with divine intuition, perceiving in it possibilities as yet undreamed of, he killed the creature, removed its shell, and fitted it with a bridge and 7 taut strings of sheep gut. Thus he created the lyre. When he had wrought the lovely instrument, he tried the chords, and made diversion meet preluding with the plectrum, and there went up from beneath his hand a tumult sweet of mighty sounds, as from his lips he sent a strain of unpremeditated wit, joyous and wild and wanton. Such you may hear among revellers on a holiday. At the end of his song, a strange desire for fresh meat tickled his infant palate, and descending quickly from Cyllene, he came to the lands where the cattle of Apollo were grazing. Picking out 50 heifers, he cunningly reversed their hoofs, and, himself walking backward, drove them away through the night to the banks of the river Alpheus, where he invented the art of making fire by rubbing 2 sticks of laurel wood together, after which he slew 2 of the heifers and offered a burnt sacrifice. At dawn he stealthily returned home, and wrapping his swaddling clothes about him lay down in his cradle like a babe utterly innocent of all guile. Nevertheless, he could not deceive Maia, who was as watchful as any human mother, and at her words of rebuke he confessed his wrongdoing, but announced that it was only the first of a program of acts which he had planned to carry out in order to achieve a place of distinction among the immortals. Soon afterward Apollo appeared, having traced, though with difficulty, the revered footsteps to the cavern. But when he charged Hermes with the theft of the cattle, the infant blandly denied it. An ox-stealer should be both tall and strong, and I am but a little newborn thing, who, yet at least, can think of nothing wrong. My business is to suck, and sleep, and fling the cradle clothes about me all day long, or, half asleep, hear my sweet mother sing, and to be washed in water clean and warm, and hushed and kissed and kept secure from harm. His denial availed him nothing, however, for Apollo haled him away to the judgment seat of Zeus on Olympus, where the king of the gods patiently listened to their statements, and highly amused at Hermes's transparent lies, dismissed them both with the advice to compose the affair by arbitration. Departing from Olympus, they came to the scene of Hermes's sacrifice. The evidences of the slaughter of his beasts enraged Apollo, but he was soon appeased by the unwonted strains of music which Hermes drew from the lyre. Thereupon, they compacted an eternal friendship and sealed it with mutual gifts, Hermes presenting the lyre to Apollo, and Apollo in his turn bestowing on Hermes the golden wand of wealth, and a lash with which to exercise dominion over the flocks and herds of the field. Hermes with gods and men even from that day mingled, and wrought the latter much annoy, and little profit, going far astray through the dun night. Hermes Argeiphontes. When Hermes was bidden to release the tethered Io, he approached her guardian Argos, and, after putting him to sleep with the music of the lyre, cut out his many eyes with his curved sword, earning for himself by this deed, it was popularly said, the title of Argeiphontes, accorded a special protection to the itinerant trader and merchant. As, however, these folks were not noted, to say the least, for their straight dealing, it was not strange that their patron should acquire a reputation akin to theirs, or that the craft and cunning required for driving a profitable one-sided bargain, combined with Hermes's gift of flitting swiftly and safely here and there, should easily exalt him to the infamous position of divine prince of thieves and cut-purses. While it is equally intelligible that the invention, as well as the abuse, of weights and measures should have been assigned to him. As a pastoral god, Hermes became in Arcadian myth the father of Pan, and his peculiar alliance with Aphrodite and certain phallic features of his cult stamp him as the producer of fertility in males. The source of his association with luck may be traceable to his traditional success in the lists of love. Many tales connect him with instrumental music, although his role in the sphere is subordinate to that of Apollo. An account of the invention of the lyre, unlike the one already related, represents him as changing Chelone into a tortoise shell and then into a lyre, because she refused to come to the nuptials of Zeus and Hera. Finally, Hermes was the patron god of the palæstra and gymnasium and of all kinds of athletic contests, and was, moreover, to the young men the model of physical strength and agility, just as Apollo was their ideal of high intellectual attainment. Hermes in art. The herm, or developed fetish form of Hermes, consists of a tall square column with stumps of arms and a phallus, and is surmounted by a bearded head. But we know next to nothing of the ideal Hermes of the 5th century, though he was sometimes shown as a well-matured young man with a short beard and clad in a chlamys. Not until the time of Praxiteles do we see him as a youth, nude or scantily garbed, shod with the winged sandals. The herald's staff is a constant emblem, other attributes being the chlamys and the travelling hat. Chapter 6. The Greater Gods, Aphrodite and Eros. Aphrodite. The origin and the name of Aphrodite. It is almost impossible to doubt that Aphrodite was a gift of the Semitic world to the Hellenic, so that the opinion, now entertained by a scant few, that the recent excavations in Crete show her to have been initially a purely Aegean creation is unfounded, since the discoveries prove no more than the great antiquity of a divinity who strongly resembled her. They do not at all remove the possibility of her having come at some incalculably early period to the Aegean Isles as an emigrant from the Phoenician coast. Many conceptions of Aphrodite bear marks of her oriental nativity, and we may point out a few of them by way of example. Her main functions were the same as those of the great Astarte or Ishtar, and substantially the same objects in nature were sacred to them both, while each was represented in the heavens by the planet Venus, and Aphrodite's epithet Aurania, or heavenly, seems to be an echo of the Eastern Queen of the Heavens. Further, the allusions in art and literature to Aphrodite's birth from a mussel shell cannot but remind one that Astarte was the patroness of the industry which produced the famous purple. In her relations to the sea and to mariners, Aphrodite bears a striking resemblance to the goddess of the Philistine city of Joppa, and her principal cult centers, Cyprus, Crete, and Cythera, had direct communication with the eastern coasts through their situation on the main sea highways. In Thebes alone of Greek cities, a place peculiarly connected with the East in legend, was she venerated as Anstress. Unhappily, the name of Aphrodite tells us nothing concerning her origin. The first half is surely connected with the Greek word form, but as to the meaning of the second, we must admit ignorance, although, in conformity with certain legends of her birth, the name was popularly interpreted as form-born. Aphrodite in Homer. Homer accepts Aphrodite as the daughter of Zeus and Dione, the earth goddess of Dodona, and numbers her among the Olympians. She is the wedded wife of Hephaestus, but is notoriously unfaithful to her vows. In an amour with Eris, she was caught flagrant delicto by her husband, whose wits were not as halting as his feet, and by another effort de cour, with Anchises, she became the mother of Aeneas. She is the golden goddess who smiles bewitchingly on both mortals and immortals, and her loveliness is the ideal of all beauty. She is the supreme divinity of love, and as such is not suited for strife. Yet she essays to take a small part in the great war. Since it was she who had put it into the heart of Helen to leave her husband and go with Paris to Troy, she favors the arms of the Trojans for the sake of being consistent, and snatches both Paris and Aeneas from the sword point of the enemy, although, in saving her son, she is wounded by the hand of Diomedes. Birth and family relationships. In Hesiod, Aphrodite is said to have sprung into being from the contact of the severed sexual parts of Ouranos with the sea, and to have been afterward washed ashore on Cyprus. The evident purpose of this myth being to account in one breath, as it were, for her simultaneous relation to the life of the sexes and to the sea. Even after Homer, she was considered as the wife of Hephaestus, and one old story alludes to Eros and Hermes as the issue of the union, although Harmonia and Aeneas were, at all periods of myth, the most famous of her children. She had a close affinity with the Horai, or Horus, and the Charites, or Graces. Ariadne, Leucothea, Galatea, and even her daughter Harmonia, as well as certain other women of myth, are to be regarded as her doubles. Aphrodite as the goddess of love. While Demeter and Dionysos were associated with the productive potencies of nature, Aphrodite was concerned with, in fact was embodied in, the reproductive powers. She was the divine personality who brought together in procreating love not only human beings, but the beasts of the field and the fowls of the air, and, moreover, was responsible for the appearance of fresh growths and new generations of plants. In the plant world, it is in the story of Adonis, which the Greeks borrowed from the East, the name Adonis being only a Greek adaptation of the Semitic form of address Adoni, or Lord, that Aphrodite most clearly appears as the force which promotes vegetation. A certain Assyrian king, the tale runs, had a daughter named Smyrna, or Mirha, whom, because of her continued disdain for Aphrodite, the goddess in anger drove to commit a dreadful sin upon her father. When he learned of her wickedness, he drew a sword and pursued her, and would have thrust her through had not the gods changed her into a myrrh tree, whose bark burst open 9 months later, revealing the infant Adonis. Aphrodite hid him in a chest and entrusted him to Persephone. But when the latter had beheld his beauty, she refused to surrender him. Whereupon the two goddesses laid their dispute before Zeus, who decreed that Persephone was to possess the youth for 1/3 of the year, and Aphrodite a 2/3. During the remaining 4 months, Adonis was to be free to do as he would. But as soon as he heard of the verdict, he gave this period of freedom to Aphrodite and became her favorite. While yet in the flower of youth, he was slain in the chase by a wild boar, and when Aphrodite grieved beyond consoling, from his blood grew the blossom of the red anemone. This graphic portrayal of the cycle of conditions through which vegetation passes in the course of a year was the theme of certain dramatic acts in the worship of Aphrodite. Among men, Aphrodite would brook no disobedience to her commands to love. We have just seen how she punished Smyrna, and it was through spurning her that Hippolytus was sent to his death. So imperiously did she sway Medea, Hippodamia, and Ariadne that they abandoned or betrayed their parents to cleave to their lovers, and with alluring promises she bribed the allegiance of the hesitating Paris, paying the bribe with Helen and her gold, while even the frigid heart of Atalante was melted to love at the glitter of Aphrodite's golden apples. The stories of others who yielded to her spell must now engage our attention. The author of the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite relates how the goddess was taken with a great desire for the mortal Anchises of Troy. Entering her temple home in Cyprian Paphos, she donned a robe more glittering than the flame of fire, and, bedecking herself with her loveliest jewels, she set out for Mount Ida, the very sight of her subduing to love the hearts of even the fiercest beasts of the wild as she made her way up the green slopes. She found Anchises alone in the sheepfolds, and through the eloquence of her beauty quickly won his affection, Aeneas being the offspring of their union. For many years, Anchises observed the injunction of Aphrodite to tell no man of their son's divine descent. But one day, in his cups, he made the secret known to his companions and was stricken dead by a bolt of Zeus. Certain others say that he slew himself with his own hand, while Virgil, as we shall see, has still another tale to tell. Beside the story of Aeneas, it is interesting to place one of Aphrodite's cult titles, that is, Aeneas, a term whose meaning is lost to us. It may perhaps be an allusion to the hero, and further, the original Aeneas may have been a priest of Aphrodite, whose song and tiresome journeying from land to land as he spread the cult of his goddess finally became crystallized into a great myth. The legend of Pygmalion and Galatea belongs to the cycle of Aphrodite. Pygmalion, a sculptor of Cyprus, failing to see any good in women, vowed himself to lifelong celibacy. Yet, like most misogynists, he still cherished in his heart a high ideal of womanhood, and to embody this in physical form, he fashioned a beautiful statue of ivory which fell short of perfection only in its lack of spiritual traits. By constant gazing on the work of his heart and hands, he at last fell in love with it, and would fain believe it was actually of flesh and blood. And when the festival of Aphrodite came around, offering the customary sacrifices to the goddess and standing by her altar, he raised a prayer. O Aphrodite, kind and fair, that what thou wilt canst give. Oh, listen to a sculptor's prayer, and bid my image live. For me the ivory and gold that clothe her cedar frame are beautiful indeed, but cold. Oh, touch them with thy flame. At these words, Aphrodite made the flame of the incense shoot aloft in 3 tongues, an omen of her goodwill, and when, after the sacrifice, Pygmalion returned to his house, he found his image endowed with the endearing charms of a living woman. She was given the name of Galatea, and with the favor of Aphrodite was wedded to the man whose loving heart had conceived her, their marriage being afterward blessed with a son, Paphos, after whom the famous city of Cyprus was named. This cycle also includes the story of Faun, who used to ferry travelers back and forth between the islands of Lesbos and Chios. One day, Aphrodite, in the guise of an old woman, entreated of him to give her in her poverty a free passage, and so ungrudgingly did he comply with the request that she bestowed a magic philtre upon him. Anointing himself with this, he became a beautiful youth who wakened love in the hearts of all the women of Lesbos, and to him, legend says, Sappho addressed some of her tenderest and most beautiful songs. The Eastern tale of Pyramos and Thisbe, borrowed by the Greeks, also reveals the old belief in the invincible power of Aphrodite. Pyramos was the most handsome youth in the kingdom of Semiramis, and Thisbe the most beautiful maiden, and their families lived in houses separated only by a party wall. Aphrodite put a mutual love in their hearts, but their parents forbade their marriage, and, what is more, even tried to prevent them from conversing with one another. Their passion, however, would brook no obstacle, and, discovering a crack in the wall between the 2 houses, unknown to their parents, they spoke sweet messages through it, until at length, filled with resolve to wed at all costs, they arranged that they should each slip out of their homes and meet that evening at a certain trysting place. Thisbe came first, but while she was awaiting her lover, a great lioness, her jaws dripping with fresh blood, suddenly approached to drink from a neighboring spring. In fear, Thisbe turned and fled, dropping her veil, which the lioness tore and left smeared with blood. Reaching the spot a few minutes later, Pyramos recognized the blood-stained veil as Thisbe's, and, thinking that it was a token of her death, he drew his sword and pierced himself through the heart, while the blood from his wound sank into the ground and, passing upward to the white berries of a nearby mulberry tree, turned them to a deep red. As Pyramos writhed on the ground in the throes of death, Thisbe returned, the sight of her veil and her lover's empty scabbard at once telling the reason of the dreadful deed. Drawing the sword from his heart, she plunged it into her own and passed away at his side. And ever since the fruit of the mulberry has been of the hue of blood. The story of the love of Hero and Leandros, or Leander, belongs to a late period when the making of myths was a more conscious and arbitrary process than formerly, and was less closely connected with religious thought. Yet it deserves consideration here by reason of its implied association with Aphrodite and its fame in literature. In Sestos, on the Hellespont, lived a beautiful maiden called Hera, who used to tend the sacred birds in Aphrodite's shrine. And in Abydos, on the opposite shore of the strait, dwelt a handsome youth named Leandros. When the time came for celebrating the festival of the goddess of love, Leandros crossed to Sestos to take part in it. In the midst of the rites it chanced that he and Hero came face to face, and at the first glance each became enamored of the other. But the modest maiden would allow no more than words to pass between them, for she had vowed to go through life unwedded. Love, however, is always stronger than discretion, and Hero's resolution at last weakened so far that she allowed her lover to meet her regularly at an appointed place. By night she would stand on an eminence and hold a torch aloft to guide Leandros as he swam across the Hellespont. But one evening a tempest arose, and though the youth plunged into the water as usual, undaunted by the high seas, his strength gave out before he could reach the other side, and he was drowned. His body was flung by the waves upon the shore before the eyes of Hera, who in the frenzy of her sorrow threw herself upon his lifeless frame and died of a broken heart. Two of the cult epithets of Aphrodite in Athens were Orania and Pandemos, the first apparently marking a transplantation of the worship of the Semitic queen of the heavens, while the second was probably a manner of recording the worship of Aphrodite by the united townships of Attic, although as early as Solon it was understood to designate the goddess as the one who presided over popular love. Aphrodite in art. Through 3 or 4 centuries, the Greeks were slowly evolving an ideal type of Aphrodite. In archaic art, she appears fully clothed, generally with a veil and headcloth, and with one hand either outstretched or pressed on her bosom and holding some attribute, the apple, pomegranate, flower, or dove, while the other hand either falls at her side or grasps a fold of a garment. Up to the middle of the 4th century, the full clothing of a figure predominates, although even as soon as the later half of the 5th century parts of her body were bared. At this period she is depicted as without passion, though capable of it, but it was only in the hands of the Hellenistic sculptors that she lost her dignity of pure womanhood and became sensuous and conscious of her charms. Eros. Eros, the frequent companion of Aphrodite, and known to the Romans as Cupido or Cupid, does not appear at all in Homer. This, however, is not to be taken as an indication that he was a later creation, for his prominence in the theogonic literature, notably that of Hesiod, points to his existence in the old daemonic stratum of religious thought. His parentage is variously given. He is the issue of chaos, or is hatched from the egg of night. He is the son, now of Oranos and Gaia, now of Hermes and Artemis, now of Iris and Zephyros. Again, he was begotten by Cronos, or born of Aphrodite. As far back as Hesiod, he was the intimate associate of the goddess of love, and he is said to have been the lover of the ocean nymph Rhodope. Both in worship and in the popular mind, Eros, whose opposite was Anteros, was the god of sexual love, and in several places his nature became coarsened through the influence of the cult of Priapos. He was attributed, especially in the later period, with the power of firing men with the passion of love by means of his sharp shafts and stinging tongues of flame. But his personality remained practically unchanged for many centuries, except in the field of philosophy, where he was held to be the cosmic force of attraction. Although Apuleius's story of Cupid and Psyche was based on a developed form of an old Greek folk tale possessing a religious significance, its excessive literary elaboration excludes it from our pages. Eros is generally shown by the artists as a winged boy bearing bow and quiver, and among his commonest attributes are the dolphin, the swan, the lyre, and the mussel shell. Chapter 7. The Greater Gods, Hephaestus and Hestia. Hephaestus. The origin and the name of Hephaestus. Whatever may have been the precise initial conception of Hephaestus, he was certainly held by the Greeks at the period of which we have clear records to be the god of fire, and as such we purpose to classify him here, his connection with the manual arts being apparently derived from the many uses which they made of fire. Whether he was Hellenic or not in origin, we cannot venture to say, but the most plausible explanation of his name tentatively links it with the basis, which would yield the meaning quivering flame. Hephaestus in Homer. Homer knows Hephaestus only as the son of Zeus and Hera, and in the epics he is unequivocally the god of fire, and at times, by a figure of speech, is fire itself, while partly as an instrument in the hands of Achilles and partly as a free agent, he consumes the waters of the raging Scamandros. In one passage he is married to one of the Graces, but in another he is the husband of the amorous Aphrodite, who openly manifests her preference for the more human Ares. Two of his characteristics stand out above all the others: his physical appearance and his trade. He is everywhere the lame god, and his limp is a constant source of laughter among his fellow on Olympus. Homer is aware of two accounts concerning the cause of this disability, one of which he puts into the mouth of Hephaestus himself. Once, he says warningly to Hera, "He, that is Zeus, caught me by the foot and hurled me from the heavenly threshold. All day I flew, and at the set of sun I fell in Lemnos, and little life was in me. There did the Sintian folk tend me for my fall." The other version is that which will be given under the next heading. Hephaestus has the distinction of being the only craftsman on Olympus, and the works of his hands are many and wonderful. The greatest of these was, perhaps, the Aegis of Zeus, although he also built the houses of the gods and wrought in his forges the sceptre of Agamemnon, the armour of Diomedes and of Achilles, and the golden tripods, which, unguided and unsupported, could enter and depart from the hall of Zeus. Through a combination of disposition and disability, he takes but little part in the strife of the Greek and the Trojan. The character and functions of Hephaestus. Mythology makes a much larger contribution to our mosaic portrait of Hephaestus than does cult, for the bold outlines of his physical appearance and the concrete nature of his activities made him a ready theme for the myth-maker and myth-monger, although these same characteristics debarred him from those phases of worship which demanded some measure of abstract thought, so that he was, in fact, the least abstract and the most concrete of all the gods. In a myth which seems to belong to a very old stratum, Hephaestus had no blood relationship at all to Zeus. Instead, like Typhon, he was merely the son of the unpaired Hera. But after she had borne him, she observed that he was a weakling and cast him down from Olympus, the fall making him lame ever after. Before he took refuge with Thetis and Eurynome in their sea home and spent his time in training his hand in the cunning of the crafts. Harbouring a grudge against his mother for her cruelty, he fashioned and sent to her a golden chair fitted with invisible snares, so that when she sat in it, she was held so fast that not even the strength of the gods could release her. Ares went to Hephaestus to beg him to come and loosen the snares, but Hephaestus drove him back home with firebrands. Although after a time Dionysus put Hephaestus under the spell of wine, and bringing him to Olympus, had him free his mother, from whom, in the end, he received full forgiveness. His lameness, humorously contrary to the modern theories of heredity, was inherited by his son Periphetes and Talos, and is observable in his doubles, Typhon and Anchises. Some students see the origin of the lameness in the unsteady movements of flame, although it has recently been suggested that a brotherhood of warriors who needed a smith god as patron accepted Hephaestus in this capacity and made him lame to prevent him from running away. To such an extent was Hephaestus the chief of god of fire that when the hearth fire crackled, men said, "Hephaestus laughs," just as they said of a shower, "Zeus reigns." He was concerned principally with terrestrial fire, the lightning being outside his province, and the conception of him as the god of the sun's heat, who rides on a glowing car by day and falls to earth at evening, was by no means general. He manifested his power in volcanoes, burning gases, and hot springs. In his relation to artificial fire, he is associated with Prometheus, and a torch race at Athens was dedicated to these two gods in conjunction with Athene. His chief volcanic center was the island of Lemnos. In his almost primeval role as worker in metal, Hephaestus, along with Athene, was the instructor of the Cyclopes in their trade. He himself was the maker of the golden maidens endowed with life and human faculties, the brazen giant Talos, Europe's brazen dog, the brazen-footed bulls with which Iason ploughed, and the gold and silver dogs that guarded the house of Alcinous, while of inanimate objects he wrought the arms of Memnon, the sickle of Demeter, the arrows of Apollo and Artemis, the curved sword of Perseus, the cup of Helios, and many other things. It may be that Hephaestus was very early identified with the demon of magical powers supposed by most primitive peoples to reside in metals both before and after forging. Apparently from the idea made current by certain physical philosophers that fire was the substance out of which life was produced, Hephaestus came to be conceived as the creator of men. Pandora, we remember, was moulded by his hand out of clay, and a hint of this function may also be read in the account of his strange fathering of Erycthonius in union with Athene. Invocations supported by magical rites were often addressed to him to bring fertility to barren women. Hephaestus in art. The artists consistently represented Hephaestus as a smith holding a hammer. Many statues of the 6th century grossly caricatured his lameness, but others merely hinted at it or almost entirely suppressed it. In the late period, he became a rare theme of art, and where he was represented at all, it was as the serious artisan. Hestia. The origin and the name of Hestia. Hestia undoubtedly belonged to an old stratum of Greek life, and unlike most of the other gods, she was herself the object for which her name stood, the hearth. For that she was not the fire, not the spirit of the fire burning on the hearth, is clear from the lack of demonic characteristics in her person. As the hearth itself, she was originally a product of the pre-animistic stage of thought, and from this stage she never advanced far, a circumstance which was due to her static nature. The other gods could exercise their activities over broad ranges of territory and peoples, but her virtue would have vanished with movement, and, like homekeeping youths, she had homely wits. Her importance rested on the imperative need of fire in the primitive home, and in the immense difficulty of procuring it in event of sudden demand. The genealogy and functions of Hestia. The earliest statement of Hestia's parentage is to be found in Hesiod, where she is the eldest daughter of Cronos and Rhea, although not a word is said of her duties as a goddess. In a Homeric hymn addressed to her, we find merely the remark that she dwells in Apollo's sacred house at Delphi, and it is to the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite that we must look for the fullest delineation. That her inviolate purity is enhanced by contrast with the easy abandon of the goddess of love, for the works of Aphrodite, says the hymn in substance, are displeasing to Hestia, the modest daughter of Cronos, whom both Poseidon and Apollo wooed in vain. With a mighty oath sworn on the head of Zeus, she declared that she would remain a virgin all her days. Wherefore her father granted her a gift instead of marriage, and she took her place in the midst of the dwelling, and was accorded high honour in the temples of the gods, and from mortals received the greatest homage. Pindar sings of her as the divine guardian of the integrity of the state. These few myths are transparent views of the functions of Hestia, who was the divine symbol of the purity of the home. As the hearth fire burned unceasingly, so was she the protectress of the continuity of the family life. But while Hera stood for the government of the household, Hestia typified rather than intimate daily relations of its members. Oats sown upon the hearth and suppliants beside the hearth were sacred to her, and all liturgical acts in both public and private life were prefaced by a special recognition of her, while there are some reasons for thinking that they were also thus closed. Nevertheless, despite her formal importance, Hestia never showed a strong directing hand in the molding of the social organization. In art, Hestia appears as a sedate matron without distinguishing attributes, the flowers and fruits with which she was sometimes shown having apparently been added solely as ornaments. Chapter 9. The Greater Gods, Dionysos. The origin and the name of Dionysos. We need only direct evidence to demonstrate visually that the home of Dionysos was outside of Hellas, for the circumstantial evidence favours that contention as strongly as arguments of this kind can support one side or another of a problem of religious origin. The orgiastic character of the rites of Dionysos was assuredly un-Greek, and the early legends which depict hostility to him in various parts of Hellas must embody the historical fact, if they contain any history at all, that certain communities resisted the introduction of his worship. Perseus fought against Dionysos. The daughters of Proetus were driven mad for their contempt of his rites, although it was these very ceremonies by which they were finally healed. The daughters of Minyas were likewise afflicted with madness for the same sin, and Pentheus of Thebes was killed for his resistance. Lycurgus, the king of the Edonians, also paid dearly for his foolish attack on the god. Homer puts the story into the mouth of Diomedes. Dryas' son, mighty Lycurgus, was not for long when he strove with heavenly gods, he that erst chased through the godly land of Nysa the nursing mothers of the frenzied Dionysos, and they all cast their wands upon the ground, smitten with murderous Lycurgus' ox goad. Then Dionysos fled and plunged beneath the salt sea wave, and Thetis took him to her bosom, affrighted, for a mighty trembling had seized him at his foe's rebuke. But with Lycurgus, the gods that live at ease were wroth, and Cronos' son made him blind, and he was not for long, because he was hated of the immortal gods. Yet the evidence does more than point away from Hellas. It indicates Thrace with some degree of definiteness. Many Greeks of the historical period were firmly convinced of Dionysus' Thracian origin, and, moreover, what little we know of the old Thracian religion shows that it had characteristics very similar to those of the cult of Dionysus, while further, the scene of action and the mad votaries of Dionysus in the Lycurgus myth are Thracian. The route of Dionysus' approach to Greece presents more difficulties than the question of his nativity. Few believe that he came directly from Thrace, at least at first, although one must admit the possibility of a late current of his cult sweeping into Greece through a straight channel. The prevailing opinion is that Dionysus was first carried by Thracian immigrants to Phrygia, where his nature as a god of fertility bound him intimately with the earth goddess of the region, who seems to have been known as Zemelo, a name strikingly similar to that of Semele, the mother of Dionysus in Theban legend. From Phrygia, the god made his way to Crete, and thence to those parts of Greece which were in close marine contact with Crete, notably Argos and the Boeotian coast. The myths of these places involving Dionysus show that here was situated his oldest establishments in Greece. He seems to have reached Athens under the kings by way of the Marathonian Tetrapolis, and his advent is celebrated in a legend which probably goes back to the 8th century, the period of the Boeoto-Euboean influence. This alleges that Dionysus came to Icarius, who dwelt on the northern borders of Attique, giving him a shoot of the vine and instructing him in its culture. Wishing to bestow a boon upon men, Icarius gave some unmixed wine to a band of shepherds, but they, having partaken of it too freely, became drunk, and believing that they had been poisoned, set upon Icarius and killed him. Later, coming to their senses, they buried his body, but Erigon, his daughter, with the aid of a dog, found his grave and hanged herself on a tree which overhung it. As a penalty for the death of Icarius, Dionysus sent upon the people an epidemic which was appeased only when they had publicly offered him the phallic emblem. And to make amends for the death of Erigon, the Attic maidens began hanging themselves, the baneful practice being carried to such an extent that for it was substituted a festival in which the young girls swung from trees. This last feature of the story probably arose when the original purpose of this ritual swinging, the excitement of sexual passion, had been forgotten. Another cult practice seems to embody as an historical fact a second and later introduction of Dionysus into Attique by way of the town of Eleutherai. The word Dionysus is divisible into two parts. The first originally, while the second is of unknown signification, although perhaps connected with the name of the Mount Nysa, which figures in the story of Lycurgus. Dionysus in Homer. Dionysus plays a very subordinate role in Homer, for he is not yet exalted to the circle of the Olympians. The poet regards him as the son of Zeus and Semele, and is acquainted with the tale of his persecution by Lycurgus, besides making him the witness of Theseus' departure from Crete with Ariadne, and recording that it was he who gave to Thetis the golden jar, the handiwork of Hephaestus, in which she placed the ashes of Achilles. The birth of Dionysus. After the birth of Dionysus, of which we have read in an earlier passage, shoots of twining ivy sprang from the ground to give a protecting shade to the infant god, and remained to deck the shrine of his mother Semele, which was afterward erected on the spot where she died, its roof being supported by pillars which fell from heaven with the bolts of lightning by which she was slain. When Dionysus had been reborn from the thigh of Zeus, Hermes entrusted him to the nymphs of Mount Nysa, who fed him on the food of the gods and made him immortal. The functions and the cult of Dionysus. The ecstatic orgies of the Dionysiac rituals and the prominence of the vine in myths relating to Dionysus are altogether responsible for the very common notion that he was primarily the god of wine, although, on the contrary, he was in reality the deity who embodied in a single being the sum total of all those unseen powers which produce all kinds of plant life. Naturally, he was given most consideration in his relation as producer of those plants on which human life most depended, and the vine, as one of these, readily became his popular symbol. Dionysus's character as a divinity of vegetation is revealed in a number of myths, where, like the Laconian Hyacinthus, he appears as alternately dying and coming to life, this being apparently the signification of his fall with Semele and of his subsequent rebirth. Under the title of Zagreus, he was thought to be torn asunder and revived, and the idea is also present in that part of the Homeric story of Lycurgus, which we have reviewed. Lycurgus represents those elements which at a certain season cause the death of all vegetation. But since these factors cannot always prevail, Lycurgus is subdued and Dionysus lives on to enjoy immortality. The continuation of this legend beyond the point to which Homer carries it is in the same vein. Dionysus, it recounts, smote Lycurgus with madness, and while in this condition, the king, in an attempt to cut the trunk of a vine with an axe, accidentally killed his own son. Still out of his senses, he foully mutilated the boy's body, but the land then withheld its fruits, and an oracle declared to the people that this state of things would continue until they had brought about the death of Lycurgus. Thereupon the Edonians seized him and bore him off to Mount Pangaion, where he was drawn asunder by horses, thus satisfying Dionysus, who caused the land to bear. It was in the character of producer of those forms of vegetation useful to men that Dionysus and his worship were spread abroad not only within Greece, as the story of Icarius demonstrates, but also without. A Homeric hymn to Dionysus consists entirely of the narrative of his introduction to a seafaring folk of the West. Once, as he was standing in the guise of a youth in his prime on a promontory overlooking the sea, some Tyrrhenian sea rovers espied him, and, capturing him, took him into their vessel, where they bound him with fetters. When with the utmost ease he burst his bonds asunder, the pilot perceived that he was a god and warned his fellows against doing him any evil. But since they would have none of his words, and trimmed their sails to make haste to the high sea, Dionysus began to show his might. First he caused wine to pour into the ship's hold, and next he made a vine laden with clusters of grapes to clamber over the sail and an ivy plant to ascend to the peak of the mast. In their fear at these wonders, the sailors tried to put to shore, but Dionysus, becoming a lion, seized their captain and forced them to leap into the sea, where they were changed into dolphins, only the pilot who had recognized his divinity being spared. Of much the same order is the account of Dionysus's wanderings after the jealous Hera had made him mad because of his discovery of the uses of the vine. From one land of the east to another he went triumphantly, spreading his cult and his gift of wine, until at last he reached distant India. But in the end he returned to Greece and took up his abode in Thebes, where he became the god idol of a horde of women votaries. He is again seen as a wine god in the person of his duplicate, Oeneus of Calydon, whose name is obviously connected with wine. And moreover, in one source it was Dionysus, not Oeneus, who was the wife of Althea, or nourishing earth.